Hello guys, welcome to Wizardium. Today we have an incredible story for you. What if Atlantis chose Harry and Hermione as its last heirs? If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The frequency of 11,000 years. The scar didn't hurt anymore. That was the thing Harry couldn't quite get used to, the absence. For 17 years it had been a barometer, a warning system, a leash. Now it was just a mark on his forehead, pale and quiet as a chalk line on a wet street. Sometimes he'd wake in the night with his hand already pressed to it, expecting fire and find nothing, just skin, just silence. He'd thought that would feel like freedom. It mostly felt like missing a tooth with his tongue. Grimmauld Place in January was not a house that forgave you for being alone in it. The heating worked now. Creature had seen to that before Harry had finally, gently, retired him with a full set of Sirius's old Quidditch books and a room of his own on the second floor. But warmth didn't fix the way the walls seemed to lean inward after dark, or the way footsteps in other rooms turned out to be nothing but the building settling. Harry had repainted the entry hall himself, Muggle-style, with actual brushes and actual paint, because he'd needed something to do with his hands that wasn't magic. The color was a deep, unremarkable blue. He'd picked it specifically because it was unremarkable. He'd spent enough of his life surrounded by things that meant something. He was on his third cup of tea of the morning, reading a Quidditch retrospective he'd already read twice, when his scar vibrated, not ached, not burned. Vibrated like a tuning fork struck against something far away, a sensation that started in the mark itself and spread down through his skull and his teeth and the backs of his hands, lasting perhaps 2 seconds before it faded entirely. He sat very still for a moment, set the mug down with a precision that was all muscle memory, the way he'd learned to move when something felt wrong. Voldemort was dead. He'd watched him fall. He'd held the Elder Wand over the body and thought, it's done, it's really done, and then felt the hollow where relief was supposed to live. So this wasn't Voldemort. He pressed 2 fingers to the scar and felt nothing, just the slightly ridged skin, the familiar geography. He reached for his tea. The vibration didn't come back. By the time Neville arrived at 10:30 with a bottle of Ogden's and a bruise on his left cheek from what he described as an altercation with a venomous tentacular that had opinions about being repotted, Harry had almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. "You look terrible," Neville said cheerfully, dropping into the armchair by the fire and examining the bruise in the reflection of a darkened window. The winter light was thin and grey through the kitchen windows, doing no one any favours. "Thanks." "Not terrible like you're ill, terrible like you're bored." Neville prodded the bruise, winced. "Reckon you should be doing something." "I'm doing things. Reading the same Quidditch book for the 3rd time and repainting walls isn't doing things, Harry. It's waiting for something to do." Harry opened his mouth to argue and closed it again, because Neville had, irritatingly, gotten very good at being right about things since the war. He'd grown into himself in a way that was still surprising to see, not taller or broader in any dramatic sense, but settled, like someone who had finally figured out where their feet went. Running the Hogwarts greenhouses, even in an unofficial capacity while Sprout recovered from her injuries, had given him an authority that sat on him naturally. He knew what he was for. Harry envied him for that in a way that had no teeth in it, only a dull, honest weight. "There's a ministry assessment next week," Harry said. "At Hogwarts, apparently everyone who was involved in the battle needs to be officially debriefed." He said it like the bureaucratic nothing that it was, pushing the word debriefed out with the same flat inflection he'd give to dental appointment. Neville made a face. "I got that letter too. 14 pages, Harry, 14, I counted. Half of it was disclaimers. They want to document what curses were used, who witnessed what, whether any of the magic performed constituted violations of post-war interim statutes." Harry recited this from memory in a voice entirely drained of feeling. "Apparently transfiguring the Great Hall floor into a battlefield counts as unauthorized structural modification. McGonagall did that. McGonagall did that. But she did it after students performed unauthorized counter-curse chains, so technically, they're going to try to make it our fault somehow," Neville said and took a long drink of Ogden's. "They're going to try," Harry agreed. "They won't get far." He said it without heat, without posturing, just fact. He'd survived Voldemort. 14 pages of ministry disclaimers were going to have to do considerably better. The fire crackled. Outside, London went about its January business, indifferent and grey and wonderfully ordinary. They sat in something comfortable, an old friendship with enough history in it to not require constant maintenance, and Harry thought briefly of the vibration in his scar and decided not to mention it. Probably nothing. The mark was 11 years old in the biological sense, 17 in the psychological one. It would take time for it to fully go quiet. He would wait. He was getting better at waiting. Neville left at 2 in the afternoon, slightly warmer from the Ogdens, promising to meet Harry at Hogsmeade Station the following Thursday for the assessment. Harry washed the cups, straightened the books on the kitchen shelf with a small automatic spell, and stood in the center of the kitchen for a moment with nothing pressing to do. Then his scar vibrated again, longer this time, 4 or 5 full seconds, with a resonance in it that felt. He reached for the right word and found, oddly harmonious. As though it were 2 notes instead of 1, a chord instead of a pitch. His hands had both come up to press against his temples without his instructing them to. He stood there in his kitchen until it stopped, then dropped his hands, crossed to the window and looked out at the street below, ordinary, grey, completely unhelpful. Right, Harry said to no one in particular. He went to get his coat. Hermione was in Melbourne when the dreams started. Not nightmares, she'd had enough of those to know the difference. These were something else. She would be asleep in the small, clean room of the rental flat she'd taken on Lygon Street, while she worked through the painstaking process of reversing the memory modification she'd performed on her parents 18 months earlier, and then she would be somewhere else, somewhere with no direct visual analogue to anything she knew. Great columns of something crystalline and slightly luminous, a blue so deep it was almost black, the sensation of water not as pressure but as presence, like the ocean had a pulse. And the language, she'd tried writing it down the morning after the third dream, pulling her notebook to her before she was fully awake and scribbling phonetically, the sounds still sitting in the front of her brain like coins on a counter. What she wrote looked like nothing in her considerable vocabulary of linguistic roots. Not Greek, not any of the pre-Homeric fragments she'd read, not Linear A or Linear B, not Sumerian, not Old Aramaic. Some of the sounds didn't have clean phonetic equivalents in the Roman alphabet, and she'd had to invent her own notation for them, which had kept her sitting at her kitchen table in her dressing gown for 4 hours, cross-referencing against 3 linguistics texts she'd brought from England, before her father knocked gently on the door and asked if she wanted breakfast. Her parents were doing well, better than she'd feared and better than she'd hoped. Her mother had her memories back fully, stitched in and intact. Hermione's obliviate had been precise, the reversal more so. The gaps it had left were conceptual, not emotional. Mrs. Granger knew she had a daughter who was a witch. She knew about Hogwarts and the war and the choice Hermione had made at 16 to protect them by removing them from the equation. She was angry about that, carefully and lovingly, in the way that people who have decided to forgive something still feel the shape of the thing they're forgiving. They had dinner together most evenings. They talked. Hermione had cried once in the bathroom with the tap running and then come out and eaten her pudding and answered her mother's questions about Hogwarts with a steadiness she'd partly faked and partly earned. She was fine. She was doing all the right things. She was also secretly, desperately bored. Not of her parents, not of the work of restitution, but of the smallness of everything now, the sense that the world had gone back to its correct size after being enormous for years, and she didn't quite fit in the normal-sized version anymore. She'd been tortured in a drawing room, she'd destroyed Horcruxes, she'd watched people she loved die and kept moving because there was no alternative. And now she was cataloguing her own dreams in a notebook in Melbourne, and wondering whether the sounds she was hearing were a symptom of stress or something she should look up in a reference she didn't own yet. She booked a flight back to England 2 weeks before the ministry assessment letter arrived. Her parents came to the airport. Her mother held on for a long time at departures and Hermione let her, breathing carefully against the familiar smell of her mother's perfume, something warm and specific that she'd spent 18 months being afraid she'd never smell again. Come back in summer, her mother said. Stay longer next time. I will, Hermione said. She meant it. She was asleep before the plane reached cruising altitude and she dreamed again, the same language, the same columns, the same deep blue. But this time there was something else, someone else, a silhouette at the edge of the space she was standing in, indistinct, facing away, but with a posture she knew the way she knew her own handwriting. She woke up somewhere over the Indian Ocean with the plane's engines humming and her notebook open in her lap and the word Harry written in her own hand in the middle of an otherwise blank page. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she closed the notebook, tucked it into her bag, and looked out at the darkness over the water and thought, with the peculiar calm of someone who has survived too much to be easily rattled, all right then. What's happening? Hogsmeade in January looked exactly like a Christmas card that someone had forgotten to take down. The snow had come in hard the previous week and not fully left. It sat in the eaves of the 3 broomsticks and packed into the cracks between the cobblestones and mounded impressively on the rooftops. Harry walked up from the station with his breath making small storms in the cold air and his hands in his pockets, and felt, not for the first time, the weird doubled sensation of a place that was memory and present simultaneously. He'd walked this road in terror and in joy and in the peculiar dull exhaustion of being 15 and certain everyone was against him. Now he walked it as himself, whoever that currently was, and tried to decide how it felt. Neville fell into step beside him near the Honeydukes Junction. He had a new scarf, Gryffindor colours, clearly hand-knitted by someone who cared about him. Neville had the look of a man being regularly fed home-cooked meals, which Harry found quietly lovely. She's already inside, Neville said by way of greeting. Harry didn't have to ask who she was. There was only one person whose presence registered that way in Neville's conversational shorthand. Course she is, Harry said. He smiled, and it was real. The castle was both the same and completely different. The scars of the battle were present in ways that would have required a deliberate effort to miss. The section of the west corridor that was still partially open to the sky, covered with a temporary enchanted barrier that let light in but kept weather out. The new stone in several stretches of the outer walls, paler than the surrounding material and not yet fully weathered to match. The portrait corridor on the 4th floor that had 3 conspicuous gaps where frames had burned. But there was also an aggressive sense of life in the building. McGonagall had opened the school in September, over ministry objections, with a student body smaller than usual but present and loud, and doing what students do, which is generate chaos in an affectionate sort of way. The corridors smelled of chalk and mildew and something faintly roasting from the kitchens. Harry's chest did something complicated as he walked through the front doors. Hermione was in the antechamber off the Great Hall, standing at a table with her coat still on, and a piece of parchment in each hand cross-referencing. Her hair was longer than he'd last seen it, her posture the specific architecture of someone who had decided a problem in front of them was going to get solved whether the problem liked it or not. She looked up when they came in. The moment she met Harry's eyes, both of their scars lit up. Not in pain, in that same vibration, the harmonic sensation Harry had been experiencing alone, but now doubled, resonant, a chord expanding into a full key. Hermione's hand went to her left forearm, not to her scar, he realized, but to the inside of her wrist, where he had no idea she'd also been experiencing a secondary vibration. Not a scar but a pulse point, as though something in her blood had been going off like a frequency-tuned compass needle for weeks. "You're feeling it too," she said, not a question. "My scar," Harry said, "not pain, more like a resonance, a vibration, in harmonics. Actually, I did the math from memory when I was on the plane. The frequency feels consistent with what physicists would classify as approximately." She stopped herself. "Never mind the classification. Yes, I'm feeling it. It's been weeks." Neville looked between them with the expression of someone who has known both these people for years and has learned to simply step back when they go into this mode. "Should I be worried?" he asked. "Probably not," Harry said. "Almost certainly not," Hermione said at the exact same moment, which, given their track record with probably not situations, satisfied precisely no one. McGonagall found them an hour later. The assessment itself had been straightforward. A ministry official named Thicket, with the disposition of a disappointed solicitor, had taken their statements about the battle in a flat procedural way, writing everything down and asking follow-up questions that suggested he was more interested in institutional liability than in what had actually happened. Harry had answered everything in a way that was accurate and unhelpful in equal measure. Hermione had answered with such comprehensive precision that Thicket had stopped writing notes around the third hour and simply stared at her. McGonagall came in after Thicket left, poured 3 cups of tea from a pot that appeared to produce them on demand regardless of whether there was actually water in it, and sat down with the posture of someone who has decided not to bother with any preamble. "Something is happening with both of you," she said. "We know," Hermione said. "It started independently. For me it was 3 weeks ago." Harry set down his cup. "For Hermione it was around the same time. It's a vibration in the original scar tissue, but it's not pain and it's not the Voldemort connection. That's gone. I checked. This is different. It's directional." McGonagall's eyebrows moved approximately 3 millimeters, which for her constituted visible astonishment. "Directional. It's pointing somewhere," Hermione said. "I spent the flight back calculating the approximate bearing from Melbourne, accounting for the secondary vibration I've been experiencing here." She touched her wrist, and cross-referencing it with Harry's scar location and the angle of resonance during the strongest pulses. "It's consistent. It's pointing northwest. From here, from Britain, it's roughly northwest, which is the North Atlantic," Harry said. A silence settled over the room that had more weight in it than the previous silence had. McGonagall looked at them both for a long moment with her hands folded around her teacup, and Harry saw something move behind her eyes that he couldn't quite name. Not fear, not quite wonder, something between the two, careful and alert. "I've been teaching magic for 40 years, she said finally. "I've seen things that had no business existing do their best to exist anyway. I've read the pre-Merlinic texts, the ones the ministry keeps in restricted consultation-only sections, which the headmistress has clearance to access." She paused. "I've read references to resonance signatures that were identified in the aftermath of what ancient texts call the departure, the sinking of an island civilization, the end of something that wizarding historians have spent centuries either mythologizing or dismissing." Hermione went very still. The specific stillness of someone who has just heard something that clicks into place against a dozen other things they'd been holding loosely, and now all of it is suddenly load-bearing. "Atlantis," she said. It didn't sound dramatic when she said it. It sounded like a calculation completing. "The texts call it by a different name," McGonagall said. "In the oldest fragments it translates approximately as the breathing place, but the civilization the myths describe, yes. The resonance signatures in those texts match partially imprecisely given the state of the translations what I am watching the two of you experience." She set down her teacup with a precision that suggested she was being careful about something. "I want you to go to the ministry. I want you to speak to the unspeakables. I want this understood before you go anywhere near an ocean." "Of course," Hermione said. Harry said nothing because he was watching the scar on his forehead doing something neither of them had mentioned yet. In the quiet of the room, with Hermione 3 feet away and that particular resonance building between them like a standing wave between two tuning forks, a faint glow was visible at the edges of the mark. Not scarlet, the way it had glowed in his worst Voldemort dreams. This was something different. Blue, a deep, still, luminous blue. Hermione's wrist was glowing the same color. McGonagall saw it first. She stood up without a word, crossed to the window, opened it to the cold January air and said very calmly, "I need the two of you to hold very still." They held very still. The glow built. It wasn't dramatic in the way that Harry's experience with magical light tended to be dramatic. No explosion of fire, no crack of displaced air. It moved outward from both points of origin, his scar and her wrist, the way heat moves through water, gradual and total. It connected between them in a line that Harry could feel but not see, a resonance that sat behind his eyes and in his sternum and somewhere in the very back of his hands, vibrating. And then it let go. The pulse that went through the room was quiet. That was the strangest part. In Harry's experience, magical detonations were loud, percussive, the world asserting itself against the thing you'd done to it. This was the opposite. This was a hush. A deep, oceanic, all-directional hush that took the air in the room and smoothed it flat, and the light expanded outward through the walls and the windows and the stone, and somewhere below them, far below in the lake, the giant squid surfaced for the first time in 3 weeks and floated at the waterline for several minutes without moving. And then it was over. The room was ordinary again. Cold January light, 3 teacups. McGonagall standing at the window with her hand still on the frame, her expression one Harry had never once seen on her face in 7 years of being her student. She was afraid, not for herself, for them, in the way of someone who has just watched something happen that is larger than she has any framework for and loves the people at the center of it more than she has any policy for showing. She turned back to them. Composed herself in approximately 0.8 seconds, which was a personal record even for her. "Well," she said, "that answers several questions and raises approximately 40 more. What just happened?" Neville said from the doorway. None of them had noticed him come back. He was holding a sandwich from the kitchens and looking at them with very wide eyes. "We're not entirely sure," Hermione said, which was the most alarming sentence Harry had ever heard from her, delivered with an equanimity that suggested she was already working on it. "Your hands," Neville said. Harry looked down. The backs of both his hands had fine tracings on them, like the most delicate possible silverwork, branching from the knuckle lines outward toward the wrists in patterns that resembled. He turned his hands over, held them up. They were warm. The tracings glowed faintly and then faded as he watched, leaving no mark, just warm skin. He looked at Hermione. She was examining her own hands with an expression he recognized, the one she wore when a problem had just become at least 12 times more interesting than she'd initially assessed. "Runes," she said. "They're runic, but the script isn't any known runic system. This isn't Elder Futhark, it isn't Younger Futhark, it isn't any of the pre-Merlinic variants in the texts I've read. This is something older." She looked up at him. "Something much older." "Ministry," McGonagall said. She'd recovered full headmistress voice. "Tomorrow morning I'll send a message tonight. The unspeakables need to see this." "All right," Harry said. "And Mr. Potter," she fixed him with a look. "When you speak to Kingsley you will be cooperative," he offered. She studied his face for a moment. "I was going to say careful," she said, "but I recognize that I'm speaking to the person who walked into the Forbidden Forest to die at 17 and actually did it, so perhaps careful is aspirational." Harry smiled. It came easier than most of his smiles did lately. "I'll be honest," he said. "That's easier." "Yes," McGonagall said, and the worry was still in her eyes, but so was something else now. Pride, maybe. Or just the particular regard of someone who has watched a person go through a furnace and come out the other side still fundamentally themselves. "I expect it is." Outside, the lake went still again. The giant squid sank back to its depth. And far, far below the floor of the North Atlantic, in chambers of crystalline stone that had not admitted light in 11,000 years, something that had been measuring resonance frequencies for longer than written history extended felt the pulse arrive, attenuated, fragmented by distance, unmistakable, and began very slowly to wake up. They took the ministry flew from Hogsmeade the next morning, arriving in the ministry atrium in a cascade of green that deposited them among the usual morning crowd of robed officials and scurrying assistants and owls delivering memos that no one had time to read. Harry straightened his coat. Hermione had her bag over one shoulder and her notebook in her hand, and the particular look of someone who has prepared extensively for a meeting they expect to be unsatisfying. She wasn't wrong. Kingsley received them in his office on the level 1 corridor, behind a desk that was substantially more organized than Harry would have expected of a man who'd spent years in operational aura work. He was the same as ever, measured, formidably intelligent, wearing his authority easily. He'd been good for the ministry. Harry genuinely believed that. He also genuinely believed that institutional instincts, even in good people, occasionally needed pushback. "Harry," he said. "Hermione." "Sit down." He gestured to the chairs. They sat. Minerva's message was thorough. "She's thorough about everything," Harry said. "The resonance incidents," Kingsley opened a folder, "have been flagged by 2 independent departments. The Magical Monitoring Office detected an anomalous pulse last night from Hogsmeade that registered on instruments in this building, and the Department of Mysteries has been experiencing secondary vibrations in several artifacts of unknown origin for the past 3 weeks." He looked up, "which correlates precisely with the timeline you've described." "What artifacts?" Hermione asked. "That's what I'm going to show you." He stood. "Come with me." The Department of Mysteries was the same corridor of unmarked black doors that Harry remembered with a particular visceral clarity. The last time he'd been here he'd been 16 and running toward what he thought was a trapped godfather, and it had gone badly in almost every way possible. He set that memory aside. He'd gotten reasonably efficient at doing that. Kingsley led them past 3 doors and through a 4th into a long room with no windows and high ceilings, lit by a cool, sourceless light that came from nowhere in particular. The room held artifacts on stone plinths, dozens of them, a museum of unknown things, each one tagged with a ministry reference number and a notation date. Most of them were still. 7 of them, distributed across the room at what appeared to be irregular intervals, were vibrating, not violently. A gentle, sustained oscillation, visible only because the artifacts cast shadows and the shadows were trembling. Harry walked the room slowly, taking stock. A piece of what looked like raw stone, heavily veined with something that might be crystal. A curved piece of metal that had clearly once been part of something larger. A sealed container of fired clay. A small, flat disc of a material he couldn't identify, which gave off the deepest blue light he'd seen outside of his own reflection in the window last night. An unspeakable materialized from a side door, robes and all, and introduced himself as Aldous Rowell. Different roles, Harry confirmed internally. The posture was wrong and the eyes were 20 years younger. He had the particular manner of someone who has spent too long in a room with no windows and developed coping mechanisms around it. They started approximately 3 weeks ago, Rowell said, looking at the vibrating artifacts with an expression that managed to be both professionally detached and personally unnerved. The oscillation is consistent and sustained, not random. I've been analyzing the frequency. He moved to a small writing table covered in charts. It doesn't match any documented magical resonance I have records of. The closest analog in the pre-Merlinic literature is Atlantean, Hermione said. She was standing in front of the flat blue disc, not touching it, studying it with her arms crossed and her head slightly tilted. This is Atlantean, isn't it? All of these? Rowell stared at her. The Ministry's working hypothesis is that they are pre-Merlinic artifacts of unknown origin. The crystal veining in the stone is identical to a geological formation that doesn't exist anywhere on the surface of the Earth. The metal is an alloy we don't have a recorded formula for. And this, she gestured to the disc without touching it. This is emitting the same frequency I've been hearing in my dreams for 3 weeks, in a language I don't fully understand but have 16 pages of phonetic transcription of. She turned and looked at Kingsley. These are Atlantean artifacts, Kingsley. They've been in the Department of Mysteries for however long, probably brought in centuries ago by unspeakables who knew what they were dealing with, and classified it into a box marked unknown because the alternative was too large to process. And they're vibrating because something just woke up down there. Kingsley absorbed this. He was very good at absorbing impossible information without blinking. 17 years as an aura, then the underground, then running a ministry in the aftermath of a war. His face gave very little away. And the 2 of you, he said carefully, are the reason they're vibrating. Yes, Harry said, both of you specifically. Yes. Kingsley looked at the artifacts. He looked at them. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Then he said something Harry had not expected from the Minister for Magic in a room full of ministry officials and classified artifacts. Are you both all right? Harry considered this. Physically, yes. Confused, yes. Slightly concerned about what it means, yes. He paused. Afraid, no. Not at all, Hermione agreed. She said it with complete honesty, which Harry believed because he knew her well enough to hear the difference between her brave voice and her honest voice, and that had been the honest one. Kingsley nodded slowly. He looked at the blue disc for a long moment. I need you, he said, to stay in London for a week while we conduct proper analysis. I need to understand what we're dealing with before anyone goes anywhere. No, Harry said. Kingsley turned to look at him with the measured expression of a man who is deciding how to react to something. Kingsley, Harry said, and his voice was perfectly even, perfectly calm, with no performance of authority in it at all, just the flat certainty of someone who knows what he's saying. I love you. I respect what you've built here. You're the best minister this building has had in my lifetime and probably in several lifetimes before mine. But something in the North Atlantic has been calling us for 3 weeks, and whatever it is lit up like this building's alarm system the second we walked in. We're not under arrest, you have no grounds for containment, and with the greatest possible respect, you are not going to understand what we're dealing with by keeping us in London. Silence. Rowell appeared to have stopped breathing. Kingsley looked at Harry for a long moment, then he looked at Hermione. Do you agree with him? Almost word for word, she said, though I'd have phrased the last part more diplomatically. That's because I'm still deciding whether to be diplomatic, Harry said. Something moved behind Kingsley's eyes that might have been the beginning of a smile if he'd let it reach his face. He didn't quite let it. 48 hours, he said. I want a full briefing when you're back. I want to know everything. You'll get it, Hermione said. And Harry, Kingsley met his eyes. Don't do anything that requires me to explain it to the Wisengamot. Define anything, Harry said. Harry, I'll try, he said with genuine sincerity. That's the best I can do. It was enough. It had to be. They were already leaving. The ferry was Hermione's idea. Not a portkey, not side along. She wanted the time, she said, and Harry understood that what she meant was that she wanted to approach this on terms that felt human. They took a Muggle ferry out from a port in Cornwall, and the North Atlantic met them in January form, grey and immense and churning with a cold that was specifically maritime, wet and pervasive, the kind that didn't just chill the surface of you but found its way into the middle. Harry stood at the bow for most of the crossing. Hermione came and stood beside him after an hour. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them was the productive kind, full of things being worked through in parallel. The direction, Harry said eventually. She had her compass out, the one she'd brought from Melbourne, recalibrated with the bearing she'd calculated. It was pointing steadily northwest. About 4 miles ahead, she said, give or take. And you believe this is real? She looked at him. Do you? I asked first. She looked back out at the water. I believe in evidence. I've got weeks of resonance data, 16 pages of phonetic transcription in a language no surface linguist has ever recorded, a room full of vibrating artifacts in the ministry, and I watched runes appear on my hands last night in a script that predates any known magical civilization. She paused. Yes, I believe this is real. I also believe it's going to be more complicated than we're prepared for. It's always more complicated than we're prepared for. That's true, Harry agreed. Are you scared? He thought about it honestly, the way he'd learned to examine his own emotional states with a bit more precision since the war. Since a very tired he more actions request aborted. Right, the next chapter now. Chapter 2, What the Ocean Remembered. The ferry's engines changed pitch 20 minutes before anything happened, a subtle reduction in rhythm, the kind that made the deck vibrate differently underfoot, that Harry noticed because he'd spent 7 years learning to read the feeling of things before they became visible. He gripped the bow rail. The cold had gone from wet to something else, something pressured and still, as though the air directly above this patch of water was heavier than the surrounding air. Hermione's compass was spinning, not wildly, precisely, making exactly 3/4 rotations and returning like something was testing it. 4 miles, she said. She'd put the compass away, give or take. It's less than that now. I know. She'd taken her coat off, which was insane given the temperature, and rolled up her left sleeve to expose her wrist. The skin there was doing what his scar was doing, not glowing, not yet, but moving, the way the surface of water moves when something large and deep passes beneath it. It knows we're close. The ferry captain had been making a course correction for the past 20 minutes, steered by something he probably attributed to a feeling or the instruments behaving strangely. Harry watched him through the wheelhouse glass, a big man in his 50s, thoroughly Muggle, frowning at his navigation equipment with the expression of someone who refuses to accept that a machine might be doing something beyond its parameters. Harry sympathized with this position more than he expected to. The passengers are going to notice, Hermione said. The passengers are below deck eating sandwiches and complaining about the crossing, Harry said. We're the only ones up here. She looked at him. He looked at her. The resonance between them was building now, that deep harmonic chord, and it was doing something new. It had direction, specifically and urgently downward, a pull that wasn't physical so much as conceptual, the way you feel drawn toward music before you make the conscious decision to move toward it. Harry, Hermione said, and her voice was different, lower, very steady. It's right below us. He looked at the water. The North Atlantic in January was not a place that forgave romanticism about the sea. It was cold enough to kill in minutes. It was dark, grey-green and moving, with waves that weren't dramatic but were relentless, the kind of sea that wore things down. It smelled of salt and depth and the specific cold chemical tang of water that had been deep for a very long time, and it was glowing. Not the surface, below the surface, some distance down, hard to gauge through moving water, but more than 20 feet, less than 100. A blue that started dark and rose through something that was almost violet and settled into the particular luminescence of something that was generating rather than reflecting light. A glow that pulsed with the same frequency that had been sitting in Harry's scar for 3 weeks, that now he could hear as well as feel, not with his ears but with the inside of his chest, a resonance that sat below hearing in the way that very low organ notes do, felt before registered. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. They looked at each other. Warming charm, she said. Pressure resistance, I know the theory but I've never applied it at depth, so we layer it with a structural reinforcement charm around the body, not just the skin, because at significant depth the issue isn't cold, it's crush, Hermione. And a modified bubblehead charm because the standard configuration doesn't account for the kind of atmospheric shift that's going to happen if we're Hermione. She stopped. She was running calculations at speed because she was afraid, and this was what she did when she was afraid, and he knew that, had known it for years, and loved it about her with a completeness that had never quite resolved into anything named but was very present. He put his hand over hers on the railing. We'll figure it out as we go, he said. We always do. She looked at him with an expression that was exasperated and trusting, and something else, something she flattened before he could read it clearly. That is both the most reassuring and least reassuring thing you could have said. I know, he said. Ready? She straightened her spine, set her jaw, met his eyes with a clarity that he recognized as the face Hermione wore when she decided something fully. Ready. They went over the side together. The cold hit first, the way cold always does, total, absolute, the body registering it before the mind catches up. Harry had his wand out before they were fully under, the warming charm already building, and Hermione was 3 feet away with hers doing the same, and something between them, not cast by either wand but generated by both of them together, the same way last night's pulse had generated from both points simultaneously, expanded outward like a dome, pressure and temperature equalizing inside it with a smoothness that had nothing to do with standard charm mechanics. The water pressed and then didn't. The cold reached and then couldn't. He looked at her through the water, both of them hovering in a pocket of warmth and breathable air that neither of them had technically created alone, and she had the expression of someone who has just had a significant hypothesis confirmed. The glow was below them, more distinct now, resolved from a general luminescence into something architectural, structure, edge, angle, the geometry of things built with intention. A city impossibly, undeniably below the floor of the North Atlantic, its uppermost point still 50 feet down from their current position, rising from a depth that the eye refused to calculate honestly. It was vast, the word didn't touch it. Vast was mountains and oceans and the night sky. This was something else, because it wasn't natural vastness, it was made vastness. The kind that comes from a civilization deciding to build at a scale that takes 1,000 years and the will of millions of people. Spires of crystalline stone, the same material Harry had seen on the plinths in the Department of Mysteries, arranged in patterns that were too precise to be anything but intentional, catching and amplifying the bioluminescent glow of something deeper in the city, and throwing it outward and upward in columns that reached the surface. In between the spires, structures, buildings, streets, open spaces that might be plazas or parks or something without a surface world name. All of it still, all of it intact. All of it waiting. Harry began to swim down. He wasn't sure when he made the decision, but his body was ahead of his mind on it, the resonance in his scar now not pulling but guiding like a compass needle settling. Hermione was beside him, her wand tucked away because she didn't need it to maintain the pressure dome. It was holding on its own, generated by the convergence of their proximity, and neither of them commented on this because commenting on it would require words they didn't currently have. The water grew lighter as they descended. At 30 feet below the surface, the Atlantic was doing something impossible. The temperature, rather than dropping as depth increased, was stable, then warmer, maintained by whatever was generating that deep blue light from Atlantis's center. At 50 feet, Harry could see the topmost point of the nearest spire clearly. It had carvings on it. The same script he'd seen on his hands, cut into crystalline stone with a precision that no modern chisel could replicate, but cut not by force, by resonance, he understood looking at the edges. They were cut by the same frequency he was carrying in his scar. The stone had been shaped by sound. At 60 feet, the nearest spire's upper gate, because it was a gate, he could see that now 2 curved sections of stone that met in an arch above a broad opening slid open. No mechanism. No visible trigger. It simply opened, both sections moving with a slow, ceremonious lack of hurry, as though they had all the time in the 11,000 years of their waiting and saw no reason to rush the final moment of it. Harry looked at Hermione. She looked at him. They swam through, they surfaced inside. That was the first impossible thing in a growing list, that there was a surface to find inside Atlantis, air above water, a breathable atmosphere maintained inside structures that were technically submerged on the floor of the North Atlantic. The air tasted different from surface air. Not stale, nothing stale about it. It moved, it was fresh in the way of deep forests, but with an undertone of something mineral, crystal, ancient. It tasted like the color blue would taste if color were tasteable. Hermione was laughing. Not her polite laugh or her relieved laugh, the real one, the slightly unhinged one that came out in high-stakes situations when the alternative to laughing was something less useful. She was treading water with her hair plastered to her face and laughing at the ceiling of the entry chamber, which arched 60 feet above them in a dome of crystal-veined stone that caught the deep light and refracted it into geometric patterns across the walls. It was the laugh of someone who has been right about something so large that rightness itself had become briefly overwhelming. "We're inside," she said. "Harry, we're actually inside Atlantis," he said. "Yes, inside Atlantis, I noticed." They found a ledge and pulled themselves out of the water, and Harry cast a drying charm out of pure practical habit, and for a few seconds they both just sat on the crystal stone ledge in the entry chamber of an 11,000-year-old civilization and dripped. Then a voice said from approximately 4 feet to Harry's left, "You are 2 hours and 17 minutes late." Harry's wand was in his hand before the sentence finished. Hermione's was slightly ahead of his, which was impressive given that she'd had it tucked into her bag strap. The speaker was, it was difficult to say exactly what the speaker was. It appeared to be a man roughly human in proportion, made of something that was not flesh or was flesh, but not flesh as any surface world anatomy would classify it. It had the quality of old stone that has been polished by water over millennia, the same bluish crystalline veining, eyes that caught light from no external source, and an expression of terminal dryness that Harry recognized as the face of someone who has waited an extremely long time for something that should have arrived without all this fuss. "Late relative to what?" Hermione said. Her wand was up but her voice was curious. "The resonance alignment. The frequency achieved optimal calling strength approximately 2 hours and 17 minutes before your arrival. You spent 14 minutes above the surface in discussion before entering the water, 7 minutes in descent. 11 minutes navigating the entry arch, which was, I note, left open for you, requiring neither key nor password in anticipation of the possibility that you might be in a hurry. The being's tone was precisely flat, not hostile, not warm, calibrated in the manner of something that has been calibrated over a very long time. I am Solon. I am the primary custodial intelligence of the Heirs reception protocol. You may think of me as a guide, though I find that description reductive. You may also think of me as a problem you will eventually solve, which would be more accurate. Why more accurate? Harry asked. He'd lowered his wand slightly. Because everything I do here will present as a problem until you understand its purpose, Solon said. This is by design. The civilization that built this place didn't trust ease. They found it suspicious. A pause. They were in many respects correct too. Hermione lowered her wand fully and stepped forward with the expression she wore when introduced to a subject she'd immediately decided to master. Are you sentient? That question from a human is always the first question, Solon said. And always the wrong one. You are not asking whether I am sentient, you are asking whether you should treat me as a person or a tool. The answer is neither category applies to me, and you should spend less time on taxonomy and more time on orientation. He turned, and the turn was smooth in a way that no human physiology would have produced, and moved toward the inner door of the chamber with a gait that was regular but not quite right, as though he'd modeled it from observation and gotten close but not all the way there. Follow me. There is a great deal to show you, and your orientation window is not generous. Are we in danger? Harry asked, following. Not presently. The more relevant question is whether the city is in danger. Solon paused at the inner door. It is. From what? Hermione asked. From what has always been the most effective destroyer of great things, Solon said. He touched the inner door and it opened. Beyond it the city began, those who love it incorrectly. Atlantis did not resolve gracefully into something describable. It refused easy language the way genuinely overwhelming things do, not by being chaotic, but by being so coherent that the mind kept wanting to reduce it and couldn't. It was a city in the way that a symphony is a sequence of notes, technically accurate and completely missing the point. Streets that curved in patterns governed by acoustics rather than traffic. Buildings whose walls breathed with a slow circulatory rhythm, not metaphorical but literal, the crystal veined stone contracting and expanding by millimeters in a cycle that Hermione measured by eye and noted at approximately 45 seconds. Open spaces that would have been parks in a surface city but were something else here, gathering points, she thought, designed around the principle that people needed places where the frequency could collect and amplify. Everything in Atlantis was about frequency. The more they walked, the more apparent it was. The city hadn't been built with architecture as its primary discipline. It had been built with acoustics, with the science and art of resonance, and architecture was the physical notation of that music. Every proportion, every angle, every choice of material was in service of a sound that the city was making, had been making for 11,000 years, even in the silence of its submersion, and that Harry could now hear clearly for the first time because his scar had stopped translating it and started simply receiving it. The people who built this, Hermione said, walking beside him with her head on a slow pivot, taking everything in, they weren't more powerful magically. Not in the sense we mean when we say powerful, they were more precise. How do you mean? Magic in the wizarding world is its force. It will express through a medium, wand or voice or hand. Even the most sophisticated stuff, the deep transfiguration theory, the complex charms, it's fundamentally force. This, she gestured at the wall nearest them where the crystalline patterns pulsed in their slow 45-second rhythm, this isn't force, it's agreement. The stone and the magic are in agreement with each other. The builders didn't impose the enchantment. They found the frequency the stone naturally wanted to respond to and they worked with it. Harry thought about this. He thought about how he'd always cast, the feeling of reaching for something and pulling it through will as a kind of grip. He thought about last night's pulse in McGonagall's office, and then about the pressure dome underwater that neither of them had consciously maintained. He thought about his wand in his hand right now and the quiet, settled feeling of the resonance in his scar, which had stopped pulling because there was nothing to pull toward. He was already here. Is that why we were chosen? He asked Solon, who was moving ahead of them at his slightly wrong gait, apparently navigating by something other than visible landmarks. The frequency compatibility? Partially, Solon said, without turning. The inheritance protocol identifies successors by 17 criteria. Frequency compatibility is the first. It is also the least interesting. He stopped at a junction where 4 streets met in a point, no, not a junction, an acoustic node, Harry realized, a place where the city's resonance converged, and turned to look at them. You want to know why you specifically? You want to understand what was seen in you that was not seen in others. Yes, Hermione said with characteristic directness. Then complete the trial of inheritance, Solon said. The answers are in the trials. The trials are not designed to test your power. He said the word with a flatness that suggested he found it vaguely tedious. They are designed to show you who you are. The answers about why you were chosen are the same answers. You cannot be told why, you have to discover it. That's very, Hermione started. Infuriating, Solon suggested. I was going to say philosophically consistent, she said, but yes, also infuriating. Good, Solon said. That means you're paying attention. He led them through the node junction and along a street that curved gradually leftward, and the buildings on either side changed character from what Harry had been reading as residential or civic structures into something that felt more institutional, more deliberate, more watched. The walls here had more of the carved script, denser and more precise, and Harry found himself slowing down to look at it, that resonance in his scar sharpening as it read what his eyes couldn't. Solon, he said, the resonance I'm feeling from the script, am I actually reading it? You are beginning to, Solon said. The air mark activates receptivity. You will not be fluent by tomorrow, but your instincts will correct themselves over time. The language is not learned through study. Hermione had stopped in front of a wall section with a long vertical inscription and was frowning at her notebook. I've got phonetic transcription of the sounds from my dreams, she said. Can you confirm your transcription is approximately 60% accurate, Solon said, which is remarkable given that you were receiving signal in a sleep state through 3 miles of seawater. He paused. You may continue your notation. It will help with the third trial. What are the 3 trials? Harry asked. Trial of memory, trial of will, trial of voice. Solon continued walking. In that order. The first begins tomorrow. Tonight you will sleep here. He gestured to a building on their left. It had an entrance, a plain arch with no gate, and beyond it Harry could see a room lit by that deep blue glow, furnished with what appeared to be actual beds, stone-framed but with materials on them that looked considerably more comfortable than stone. The Atlanteans apparently had figured out how to maintain textile materials for 11,000 years. Rest is not optional. The trial of memory will require that you be fully present. Why? Harry asked. Solon looked at him for a long moment. There was something in those light-catching eyes that might have been in a human face, compassion, or its precursor, a kind of preparedness for someone's pain. Because it will surface everything you have tried to forget, Solon said. And you, Harry Potter, have tried to forget a great deal. Harry looked back at him without flinching. I know, he said. Yes, Solon said. That is one of the reasons you are here. They didn't talk much before sleeping. The room was warm. The city maintained temperature through the same frequency principle as everything else, the stone itself generating the heat from its internal resonance, and the beds were unexpectedly, almost offensively comfortable, which Hermione observed was probably a sign of a civilization that had understood the value of rest in a way that modern magical culture hadn't quite managed. Harry lay on his back staring at the ceiling, the crystal patterns making slow geometric progressions above him in the deep blue light, and listened to the city breathe. Hermione, he said. She was still writing in her notebook. He could hear the pen moving. What Solon said about the trial of memory surfacing what we've tried to forget. The pen stopped. I heard, she said. Are you going to be all right with that? A silence, not the easy kind. I don't know, she said, which cost her something, he could tell. Hermione admitted to not knowing things the way other people admitted to having made mistakes, with care, with precision, because the admission mattered. There are things I've set aside, things I've told myself I'd process later when there was time, and there hasn't been time, and now there's going to be time, he said. Now something is going to make there be time, she said, with a rueful quality that was also the beginning of acceptance. He turned his head to look at her. She was sitting up, notebook in her lap, and in the blue light of the city her face was doing several things at once, tired and alert and braced for something. She felt his eyes and looked at him. What about you? She asked. He considered it. All the things in the category of things Harry Potter had set aside because the alternative was not surviving long enough to set them aside. The war, the people who died in it, the specific faces and names, Sirius, Lupin, Tonks, Fred Weasley's face in the Great Hall, Dobby in a garden by the sea, the forest and the stone and the walk he'd made alone, and the moment when he'd understood that understanding had to come before grief because grief would have prevented the understanding. He'd put all of it in a box labeled later, and later had not quite arrived. I'll be all right, he said. That's not what I asked. He looked at her. No, he said. I don't know if I'll be all right with it. But I'm not going to not go through with it. There's a difference, she said. Yeah, he said. There is. She looked at him for a moment longer with something in her eyes that was careful and steady and older than either of them strictly were. Then she closed her notebook, settled onto her side facing the wall, and said, Get some sleep, Harry. You too, he said. He lay there for a while longer, listening to the city's slow pulse, feeling the resonance in his scar not as intrusion or warning but as something that rhymed from somewhere very deep, with the feeling of finally being somewhere he was supposed to be. It was a new feeling. He didn't have a name for it yet. He decided to find the name later. Right now there was sleep to get and an impossible trial to survive in the morning. He closed his eyes. The city breathed around him. 11,000 years of waiting, finally reaching its end. 3 levels below them, in chambers that Solon had not led them to, that the city's inheritance protocol had not yet unlocked, a figure stood before a scrying pool of still water lit from beneath by the same crystal light that everything in Atlantis ran on. The figure was old. Not in any surface world category of old, not elderly, not ancient-looking, not the accumulated visual decline of a body that has been alive too long. Old in the way of things that have outlasted their context, that have continued past the world that gave them their shape and had to find new shapes in the wrong era. He was tall, he was still. He wore robes that had once been ceremonial and were now simply clothing. The embroidery faded to a suggestion of itself, the deep blue ground cloth unchanged because the material, like everything in Atlantis, didn't degrade by any mechanism the surface world would recognize. His name was Erasmus Vale. He had been a counselor of the Seventh Circle of Atlantis when the city had chosen to submerge. He had been the one to execute the submersion protocol. He had been the one to put himself into the crystalline suspension that passed for sleep at the deep level, not quite stasis, not quite consciousness, a maintenance state for 10,000 years while the city waited, and to emerge from it 3 centuries ago and take up the work of watching. He had been watching ever since. The scrying pool showed him the heir's room, the girl writing in her notebook, the boy staring at the ceiling. Vale studied them with the careful attention of someone who has thought a great deal about a problem and is now looking at the problem itself for the first time. He noticed the boy's eyes, the quality in them when he'd said he didn't know if he'd be all right. He noticed the girl's pen going still. He noticed the way they spoke to each other, the specific rhythm of 2 people who have learned to carry weight together without formally agreeing to. He noticed that they were formidable. He would have preferred them not to be. It would have been easier. Instead, they were exactly the kind of people that the inheritance protocol was designed to find, and exactly the kind of people whose presence here complicated everything he had spent 300 years planning. The city had chosen them. The city had not, in Vale's considered opinion, made the right choice. He had spent 11,000 years loving Atlantis with a completeness that no surface creature could match or measure. He had kept it alive through periods of the Earth's geological violence that should have destroyed it. He had maintained the frequency, maintained the crystal matrices, maintained the biological support systems, maintained everything alone and without recognition because the city needed him and he needed the city, and that was sufficient. He had done this when there was nothing else to do it for, when the surface world above was burning through its various catastrophes, and the ocean was indifferent and the city slept. And now the city had decided 2 surface-born children who had been alive for less time than Vale had spent in a single one of his maintenance cycles, were the right answer to the question of succession. He turned from the scrying pool, crossed to the far wall where a console of sorts, not technological, not mechanical, something in between, managed several of the city's secondary systems. He touched specific points in a specific sequence that Solon did not know he knew. The trial of memory, scheduled for tomorrow morning, was designed to surface difficult personal history. That was its stated function, and it was a real function, but it had a secondary parameter that had not been used in 11,000 years, a setting that could be calibrated to amplify the surfacing beyond what a person's psyche could metabolize cleanly, not breaking, not quite, but close enough that the resulting disorientation would compromise the trial completion. He calibrated it. Very carefully, precisely, not to destroy them. He was not interested in destruction. He was interested in demonstration, in showing the city, in whatever sense a city could be shown things, that it had made a category error. Then he stood back and looked at his hands for a moment, long-fingered, slightly luminous, marked with the same crystalline veining that had been there since the submersion, since he'd spent 10,000 years as something that was more crystal than flesh and emerged remembering everything and changed by more than he'd expected. He had loved Atlantis for 11,000 years. He had been its guardian, its sustainer, its rememberer. He was still all of those things. He was also, in ways he had stopped examining too closely, its prisoner. He turned that thought over once and then put it somewhere he didn't look at it. Upstairs, in the warm room that the city had prepared with something that might have been care, the girl finally set down her notebook. The boy's breathing had deepened into sleep. She looked at his face for a moment in the blue light, with an expression that she would not have allowed if she'd known anyone was watching, that was specific and unguarded and had been building for a long time. Then she lay down and she also slept. Vale watched the pool go still. Then he went to his own deep chambers and began to wait, which he had always been extraordinarily good at. The trials would begin at dawn, or what passed for dawn, 11,000 years below the surface of the North Atlantic. Chapter 3. The city that breathed Atlantis did not have a sunrise. What it had was a shift, a slow intensification of the crystal light that began at the city's deep core and moved upward through the resonance network in the walls and floors and spires, brightening by degrees until the chamber they were sleeping in went from the deep blue of a night sea to something warmer, more amber-toned at the edges, the color of shallow tropical water over pale sand. It took about 20 minutes, and it was, Harry thought, sitting up in the middle of it, the most gradual and convincing imitation of morning he'd ever experienced in a place with no sun. He'd slept deeply, dreamlessly, which was unusual. Harry's sleep had been populated with various unwanted guests for most of his life, and even after Voldemort's death the dreams had continued, different in character but no less present. Here there was nothing. 8 hours of clean dark, and then the light coming up through the walls and him sitting upright and feeling, with a certainty that he didn't examine too closely, that today was going to require everything he had. Hermione was already dressed. This was not surprising. She was sitting at the edge of her bed with her notebook open and her pen moving. and she had the look of someone who had been awake for at least an hour doing what she always did when she was preparing for something difficult, which was to gather every piece of information that could possibly be gathered and organize it into a structure that would hold up under pressure. "Morning," Harry said. "There are 17 distinct glyphs in the script visible from this room alone," she said without looking up. "I've matched 9 of them to the phonetic transcriptions from my dreams. The remaining 8 don't correspond to anything in my notes, which suggests either that the dreams were sampling selectively from the full language, or that there are sounds in the full Atlantean register that don't translate into any phoneme I can access in REM state." She looked up. "Good morning. There's water on the ledge. It appeared while you were sleeping. I don't know what the delivery mechanism is." Harry looked at the ledge near the entrance. A stone vessel of clear water and what appeared to be food, compact, crystalline in appearance, nothing he recognized. He crossed to it, tasted the water. It was the same as the air, mineral and clean and ancient in some quality he couldn't name. "Solon," he called. "Present," Solon said, from just inside the entrance, which meant he'd either been there the entire night or had arrived so silently that neither of them had heard him. Harry suspected the latter was a deliberate demonstration. "The trial of memory," Harry said. When you've eaten," Solon said. "Not before. The trial places significant demands on the body's regulatory systems. Food is practical, not ceremonial." Harry ate without tasting much, which was fine. Hermione ate methodically while continuing to write, which was a skill Harry had always admired as a kind of advanced multitasking that he himself had never managed. Solon waited with the equanimity of something that had been waiting for 11,000 years and found this particular 10 minutes entirely unremarkable. "Rules," Hermione said, putting the pen down. "For the trial, what are the parameters?" "The trial has no rules in the conventional sense," Solon said. "It has conditions. The first condition, you experience it alone, each S separately in sequence. The second condition, nothing that surfaces during the trial can be interrupted by external intervention. What the memory shows, it shows completely. The third condition, the trial ends when the heir accepts what they have seen, not when they have seen it, when they have accepted it." "What's the difference?" Harry asked. "Seeing is passive," Solon said. "Acceptance requires a decision. The trial can last minutes or years, depending entirely on the heir's willingness to decide." "Years," Hermione said. "It has happened," Solon said simply. "Not often, but it has happened. The trial is not punitive, it is not designed to harm, but it does not accommodate avoidance." "Who goes first?" Harry asked. Solon looked at him. "You." The chamber of the trial of memory was not what Harry had been picturing. He'd been bracing for something theatrical, a great space with dramatic architecture, the kind of place that announced its importance. Instead, Solon led him through 3 turns of corridor and stopped in front of a door that was, by Atlantean standards, plain. No elaborate script, no crystal inlay. Just a rectangular opening in the wall, and beyond it a room that was the same dimensions as a decent-sized living room with nothing in it. No furniture, no light source visible, just the walls and the same gentle luminescence coming from the stone itself. "When you step in," Solon said, "the door will close. I will be outside it. Hermione will wait in the preparation room 2 corridors back." He paused. "There is something I should tell you before you enter." Harry looked at him. "The trial as calibrated by the inheritance protocol is designed to be demanding but navigable," Solon said. There was something in his voice, not quite urgency but an adjacent quality, a precision that was different from his usual flat delivery. "I want you to be aware that the calibration was adjusted during the night. I detected the adjustment this morning. I have partially corrected it, but not fully. The mechanism that was modified operates on a layer of the city's systems that I cannot override without authorization from a confirmed heir, which requires completion of this trial." He looked at Harry steadily. "Which means the trial you will experience today is harder than it was designed to be. Not impossible, not intended to destroy you from what I can assess of the intent behind the adjustment, but harder." Harry processed this. Someone changed the settings. "Yes, someone who knows the city's systems well enough to access a layer you can't override." "Yes, tell me who later," Harry said. "Right now it doesn't change anything." Solon studied him. "Most people," he said, "would want to delay to understand the threat before proceeding. Most people haven't been in a situation where delaying was ever actually safer than moving forward," Harry said. He said it without bitterness or performance. Just as a fact about his own history, stated cleanly. "Open the door." Solon stepped aside. Harry walked in. The door closed behind him without sound. For a moment nothing happened. He stood in the center of the room and breathed and felt the resonance in his skull running at its usual frequency, steady, present, the way his own heartbeat was present, noticeable only if he concentrated on it. The walls glowed their ambient blue, the room smelled of crystal and depth, then the floor gave. Not structurally, not a collapse. A give, like the surface tension of water breaking when you put your hand through it. The room's geometry shifted, and Harry's stomach lurched with the displacement the way it did when a portkey grabbed you and the world went away. And then the new thing arrived with a completeness that made him grab for his wand before he understood that his wand was irrelevant here. He was standing in the Dursleys' kitchen. The specific smell of it hit first. That was what Hermione would later identify as the trial of memory's true mechanism. Not visual, not narrative, but sensory. The full sensory environment of a given memory reconstructed with a precision that bypassed the analytical mind entirely and hit the animal one, the one that doesn't distinguish between memory and experience. The particular smell of bleach and overcooked vegetables and his aunt's floral air freshener. The linoleum floor with the worn patch near the cooker. The sound of the television from the next room, too loud, always too loud. He was small. He was looking at the underside of the counter, which meant he was perhaps 7 years old, and he was pressing himself against the cabinet doors, and there were sounds from the other side of the kitchen. His uncle's voice. Something had gone wrong with dinner, something minor and catastrophic in the way that only the Dursleys' kitchen disasters could be both simultaneously, and he was calculating with the automatic expertise of a child who has learned this calculation so deeply it has become reflex. Exactly how much space there was between his current position and the cupboard under the stairs. He knew this was memory. He knew he was Harry Potter, 20 years old, standing in an Atlantean trial chamber. He knew it with the part of him that was watching from somewhere above the experience. But the body he was in right now was small and afraid in the specific visceral way of being 7, and knowing that the only safety available was a dark cupboard, and that even that wasn't quite safe, just safer. He stayed with it. He didn't run, he breathed. The kitchen dissolved. Hogwarts appeared, specifically the corridor outside the Gryffindor common room in his first year, and he was standing in it at night, past curfew, having heard something, and ahead of him the corridor was bending toward one of those encounters that his first year had been full of, near misses and barely understood dangers and the dull, persistent fear of a boy who had been told he was nothing for 10 years, and was still, even now, not entirely sure the story wasn't true. Then the forest. He was 11 and the forest was dark and something was moving toward him in it that was wrong in a fundamental way. Then the chamber and the basilisk and Ginny on the floor and the feeling of Tom Riddle's smile. Then 3rd year and Sirius and the Dementors on the lake, the cold of them, that specific cold that was the opposite of warmth in the same way death was the opposite of life, and his mother's voice starting, always starting before the darkness took him. He breathed. He stayed. The trial kept going. The point where Harry had understood the Atlantean enhancement was working, the calibration that Solon had warned him about, was the moment when the memories stopped coming in chronological order and started coming in weight order, the heaviest ones. The ones that carried the most, not the most dramatic, not necessarily the most violent, the ones that had cost the most to carry afterward. Cedric Diggory's body on the ground at the end of the Triwizard Maze, and the specific feeling of Harry's hands gripping him and the way Cedric weighed and didn't weigh, and the impossible mechanical fact of teleporting back with a dead boy. That one hit with a force that the chronological version hadn't. It was saturated in a way that standard memory reconstruction wouldn't have produced. Someone had turned the saturation up. Harry felt the weight of Cedric's body in his arms in a way that his nervous system registered as immediate and real, and for a long moment the watching part of him went very small. He breathed, Sirius falling through the veil, not the sight of it, the knowing of it, which was different. The second of not understanding, and then the scream that he hadn't let fully happen because there were Death Eaters and there was still fighting, and you didn't have time to, he breathed. The forest, not 3rd year this time, his forest, his night. 17 years old and walking toward Voldemort with the resurrection stone in his palm and his parents around him and Sirius and Lupin, and the specific quality of that love, not comfort, exactly love and grief in the same breath, the way they had to be when there was no more time, and the moment when he let the stone fall because the next step required both hands and no stone, just himself, just what he was made of, just the inside of the decision. The watching part of him started to lose purchase. The enhanced saturation was doing its work. The memory was no longer adjacent to the present, it was enclosing it. He was in the forest and he was cold and he was 17 and this was happening. This is memory, he told himself. This already happened, you already walked through this, you did this, it's already done. The words weren't enough, he said them and meant them and they weren't enough. He thought about what Solon had said, the trial ends when you accept what you've seen. He thought about what that meant, not surviving it, not enduring it, accepting it. He had been treating the trial as something to get through, that wasn't the criterion. He stood in the cold dark of the forest at 17 and let it be real. Let it be the thing it was, not a trauma to outlast but an experience that was genuinely part of him, that had happened to him and made him something and cost something real and was not going to unhappen and was not going to stop being part of the cost of being Harry Potter. And that was a thing he had been almost at peace with and then never quite finished being at peace with, and the trial had found the not quite finished part with the precision of a surgeon. He stood there. He breathed, he looked at the dark between the trees and let it be the dark it had been. It already happened, he thought, and this time the meaning was different, not dismissal. Acknowledgement, it happened, I carried it, I carry it, it's mine. The forest dissolved, he was back in the room. The walls were blue, his knees were on the floor, he didn't remember kneeling. His face was wet, he raised his hand and found tears which surprised him less than the fact that he felt, underneath the rawness of the trial, something that was quiet and clean in the way of rooms that have been thoroughly cleared out. He sat on the floor of the trial room in Atlantis for a moment, breathing. The door opened, he stood up, straightened. Wiped his face with the back of his hand, which he recognized as both practical and a reflexive bit of Harry Potter performance of being all right, and walked out. Solon was there. Solon did not comment on his face or his posture or the fact that Harry had clearly been kneeling on the floor. He simply looked at him with those light-catching eyes for a moment. Accepted, Solon said. It wasn't a question. Accepted, Harry said. Duration 43 minutes, Solon said. The calibration adjustment extended estimated duration significantly. Your actual time was, Solon paused, and something that might have been approval moved through his expression. Considerably shorter than I expected. Where's Hermione? Harry asked. Waiting. Are you prepared to? Yes, Harry said. Get her. Hermione walked past him on her way to the trial room with her notebook tucked into her bag and her chin set at the specific angle that meant she had decided something. He fell into step beside her for the length of the corridor without speaking, and she glanced at him sideways and registered his face, the rawness of it, the clean quality underneath, and he saw her understand what the trial had cost and what it had left, and she put her hand briefly on his arm as they reached the door. Not stopping, not making it into a moment, just contact, real and grounding, the kind that says I see you without requiring an answer. Then she walked in. He stood outside and listened to the silence. He went and sat in the corridor with his back against the wall and his knees up and his head back against the stone. The city breathed around him. He closed his eyes and let himself be in the aftermath of the trial without performing anything, which was the luxury of being alone in a place where no one needed him to be fine. He didn't know how long had passed when the door opened and he heard her steps and looked up. She was standing in the doorway. She was entirely composed. Her spine was straight, her chin was level. She was looking at him with eyes that were very bright. No visible tears, but the brightness was of the aftermath of them. There was something in her face that hadn't been there before the trial, a specific kind of openness, as though the structures she usually kept between herself and the world had been carefully examined, and several of them had been quietly removed. He stood up. She looked at him for a moment and then she said, "My parents didn't remember me for 18 months. I know they do now. I know the memory modification was completely reversed. I know they love me and I know they've forgiven me and She stopped, started again. I'd never let it be real, the 18 months, what it was to have done that to them and live with the doing of it. I moved on. I had to move on. There was always something next." She exhaled. "The trial made it be real." "Yeah," Harry said, "that's what it does." She looked at him steadily. "You're all right." I'm actually all right." He meant it. "Come on, Solon's waiting." They walked back through the corridor side by side, and neither of them had the same specific weight they'd been carrying since the war, because the weight was the same but its relationship to them had changed, acknowledged rather than braced against, present instead of pressed down. It was easier, surprisingly, genuinely easier. Harry had not expected that. Solon met them at the preparation room with an expression that remained professionally neutral but had something in it that Harry was starting to recognize as the Solon version of relief. "Both trials accepted," he said. "What does that mean for the city?" Hermione asked. "It means you are confirmed as probationary heirs," Solon said. "The city's secondary systems, the ones currently locked at heir authorization level, will now respond to your presence. You'll find that some doors that were closed will open. Some aspects of the resonance network will become available to you." He paused. "It also means that whoever adjusted the trial's calibration will be aware that you succeeded." "Good," Harry said. Solon looked at him. "I want them to know," Harry said simply. The city that opened to them in the afternoon was different from the city of the morning, not physically, but in terms of access, in the way a face becomes different once you know the person behind it. Streets that had seemed simply decorative now had function apparent in them. The acoustic nodes that Harry had begun to identify revealed their purpose as something like a citywide communication system, a way of sending information through the resonance network that was simultaneously more sophisticated than any owl post and more elegant than any flu. Hermione spent 40 minutes at one of the nodes experimentally and came away with 6 pages of new notation and an expression of barely contained intellectual joy. "It's not just communication," she said, catching up to Harry, who'd been examining a particular wall section. "It's storage. The resonance network stores information in the frequency modulations of the crystal matrices. The city itself is a library. Everything the Atlanteans knew, every piece of research, every record, every history, it's in the walls. You'd need to be able to read the frequency to access it, but it's there, Harry. It's all still there." He looked at her. The expression on her face was something he was going to remember for a long time, the pure, unguarded joy of someone who has walked into the largest library in human history and understood what they're looking at. He smiled. "Don't cry," he said. "I'm not crying," she said, which was technically accurate in that the tears hadn't fallen yet. "Of course not." She pressed her fingers briefly against her eyes and then straightened with dignity. "The trial of will," she said. "Solon mentioned it earlier." "Do you know when?" "Tomorrow," Solon said from behind them. He'd been there for a while, Harry suspected. "Today you have until the city's cycle completes. Learn what you can, walk where you're drawn. The city will teach you what it wants you to know before the second trial." "And the third trial?" Harry asked. "After the second." Solon began to move away. "The third trial is the most important. It cannot be completed by either of you alone." "The trial of voice," Hermione said, remembering. Yes, Solon paused without turning. "It requires a frequency that neither of you generates independently, but together." He left it there. Not as a dramatic effect, Harry thought, but because Solon genuinely didn't know the end of that sentence and he was constitutionally opposed to stating things he didn't know. The city's guide would not speculate, he would simply wait and see. They spent the rest of the day in the city, properly without direction, following what the resonance pointed toward. Harry found himself drawn to an open space, what he'd been reading as a plaza, in the center of a residential district, where the acoustic geometry of the surrounding buildings created a standing harmonic that he could feel in his chest and the backs of his hands. He sat there for an hour. He wasn't meditating exactly, he didn't have a framework for what he was doing, but it felt like the city was talking to him in a language he was learning not by studying it but by proximity, the way you learn a language from being immersed in the place that speaks it. His scar pulsed. He followed the pulses. He let the city in. Hermione mapped. She couldn't help it, it was how she processed things, by building a structure around them, and mapping Atlantis was the most extensive and rewarding mapping project of her life, which was saying something. She had 7 pages of careful drawings by the time the light cycle began its shift toward the equivalent of evening. She'd also had what she called a conversation with the resonance network at 3 separate nodes, which she meant quite literally. The network had responded to her frequency modulations, had sent back modulations that were clearly responsive rather than random, and she had the beginnings of an exchange in her notebook that she intended to work through tonight. They met back at the room the city had given them and found that the stone vessel had been refreshed, more water, more of the compact crystal food that turned out to taste, on closer examination, of something satisfying and specific that was different for each of them. Harry's tasted of something warm with a meat quality. Hermione's, she told him, was nutty and complex in a way that reminded her of food from her parents' kitchen. The city is personalizing it, she said. Of course it is, Harry said. That's not as strange as it sounds. If the resonance network has been reading our frequencies since we arrived, I said, of course it is, I'm not arguing. He looked at her over the stone vessel. I'm just thinking that it's a very long way from Hogwarts. She looked back at him. Is that bad? No, he said, and he realized as he said it that he meant it, that for the first time in the 8 months since the end of the war he was not waiting for something to do or bracing against the absence of purpose. He was here in this impossible place doing something that was not about prophecy or fate or someone else's plan for him, and it felt the way he imagined sailing would feel. Movement chosen and directed, wind and weight, and the sense that the destination was real. No, he said again, it's not bad at all. What neither of them noticed, because they were not looking at the right level of the city's system, and Solon had not yet told them to look, was that the city's resonance network was doing something unusual that evening. The pulse that had been running at its standard 45-second respiratory cycle was developing a secondary rhythm, shorter, irregular, almost conversational in character, that moved through sections of the grid that hadn't been active in centuries. The sections were the deep chambers, veil sections. He was using the network, not for communication, there was no one to communicate with. He was using it the way someone uses a knife they're sharpening, running the frequency through the crystal matrices in a specific pattern that was doing something precise and invisible to the trial infrastructure. The trial of will, scheduled for tomorrow. Vale had not been idle today. He'd watched the memory trial results come through the resonance, both heirs completing, both accepting, the duration short enough to be remarkable. He'd revised his assessment of them upward. Specifically upward in the category of people who do not break cleanly. The trial of will was more subtle than the trial of memory. The memory trial worked on what had happened. The will trial worked on what the heir wanted. It surfaces the thing they most want that they have been refusing to fully want, and it asks them whether they want it enough to say so, which sounds simple and is not. What Vale had discovered in 300 years of studying the system was that the trial of will had a vulnerability that the trial of memory didn't. The memory trial required acceptance of what was. The will trial required acceptance of what could be, and could be was infinitely easier to deny. People were very good at not wanting things they decided they couldn't have. He thought about the girl's face, what he'd seen in the scrying pool when she'd looked at the sleeping boy last night. He thought about the boy's hands on the ferry railing, and the way the resonance between them had built not like a meeting of 2 frequencies, but like a conversation between 2 people who had been speaking the same language for years without noticing. The will trial's default configuration would ask them to confront what they wanted most. The modification Vale made careful, surgical, smaller in scope than what he'd done to the memory trial because he'd learned from watching what kind of people these were would add a specific pressure. The trial would give them what they wanted and then offer them the choice to keep it or release it. Most people under pressure chose to release, because keeping it was terrifying in a way that losing it wasn't. He finished the modification, stepped back from the system. Then he stood in his deep chamber and thought about what he was doing with the quality of attention he gave to all his decisions, not second-guessing but honest accounting. He was trying to stop people he considered unsuitable from inheriting a civilization he had given 11,000 years of his existence to protect. The methods were indirect, not lethal, designed to demonstrate unsuitability rather than cause harm. These were defensible positions. He was also, in the accounting he tried to be honest about, afraid, not of them, of what their succession meant. If the city accepted them, it would mean that his 11,000 years of guardianship had been not wrong but not the point. It would mean he had been the caretaker and not the inheritor, the custodian and not the heir, and that the heir had been waiting to arrive from the surface world in the form of two young people who didn't know the language yet and had only been here for a day. He had given everything, he had been given nothing but the obligation to continue giving. He picked that thought up, looked at it and put it back down. There was work to do. He went to his scrying pool and watched the city breathe, and in the rooms above him the heirs slept, and the city that had been waiting for 11,000 years held them in its slow blue pulse like something that had been holding its breath for a very long time and was still not yet ready to let it go. Chapter 4. What counselors remember he came to them at breakfast. No announcement, no dramatic entrance. One moment the preparation room contained Harry, Hermione, the stone vessel, and the morning light cycle doing its slow amber shift through the walls, and the next moment it also contained Erasmus Vale, standing in the archway with his hands at his sides and his robes hanging in their ancient faded ceremony, looking at them with the measured attention of someone who has thought very carefully about what expression to wear to this meeting. Harry registered him first. He didn't reach for his wand, the resonance in his scar had changed pitch, a half-step shift that felt like a warning but not a threat, distinction he'd learned to trust during the war in a way that was now bone-deep reflex. He simply looked at Vale across the room and waited. Hermione looked up from her notebook. She took in Vale completely in about 2 seconds, height, age quality, the crystalline veining in his hands and around his temples, the robes, and then looked at Harry, and the conversation they had in that glance was entirely wordless and entirely clear. "You know who this is? I have a guess. It's a good guess." "Erasmus Vale," Solon said from somewhere behind Vale in the corridor, his voice carrying its usual flat precision but with something underneath it that was new, not quite anger, not quite its own category. "Counselor of the Seventh Circle, architect of the Submersion Protocol." A pause. "You were not invited here." "I was not uninvited," Vale said without turning. His voice was what Harry would remember afterward, deep and careful, accented in a way that no living language produced anymore, something that had been maintained across 11,000 years as a matter of will rather than community. It was the voice of someone who had been talking to himself in the same register for centuries. "Solon, don't perform surveillance protocols at me. I know you detected my modification to the memory trial calibration. If I'd wanted to conceal it, you wouldn't have found it. An act of restraint I appreciate less than you seem to expect," Solon said. Vale turned then, just partially, and something passed between him and Solon that Harry couldn't fully read but recognized in category, the specific friction of two people who have shared a space and a purpose for a very long time and developed complicated feelings about both. Then Vale turned back to Harry and Hermione and crossed the room and without asking permission sat down. Harry watched him do it with the calm of someone who finds this interesting. "You adjusted the memory trial," Harry said. "Yes," Vale said, "to make it harder, to make it more accurate," Vale said. "The standard calibration is designed for candidates with a reasonable amount of difficult personal history. You both have an unreasonable amount. The standard calibration would have given you a comfortable sampling. I gave you the actual material." He looked at Harry without blinking. "You completed it in 43 minutes at the enhanced setting. That is either a testament to your psychological resilience or evidence that you've become so accustomed to surviving terrible things that the process of accepting them has become automatic." He paused. "I haven't decided which. Does it matter?" Harry asked. "To me, yes," Vale said. "To the city, probably not." Hermione had put her notebook down. She was looking at Vale with an expression Harry recognized as the one she wore when she was deciding whether someone was an enemy or simply a complication and leaning toward the latter. "You've been here the whole time," she said, "since the city submerged." "Not the whole time," Vale said. 10,000 years in crystalline suspension, the last 300 years awake." He said this without any bid for sympathy, simply as data. "I was the last functioning counselor when the others chose suspension. I executed the submersion. I put the city to sleep and then I went to sleep myself. When I woke, the city was intact, the city was alone, and the inheritance protocol had been measuring resonance signatures from the surface world for 10 millennia without finding a pair that met the threshold." He looked between them. "Then 3 weeks ago the protocol found you, and you objected," Hermione said. "I have concerns," Vale said with the particular care of a man who has decided on his precise language before arriving. "Concerns that I would like to put before you directly because I am not interested in subterfuge as a primary strategy. The modification to the memory trial was a test, not an attack. I needed to know what you were made of before having this conversation." "You could have just asked," Harry said. "I find that people perform themselves in conversation," Vale said. "How they respond under pressure is more informative." He looked at Harry with something that was not quite respect but was adjacent to it. "You didn't break, you didn't deflect, you walked into a trial you'd been told was harder than intended and you completed it anyway, and when you came out you asked where your companion was before you asked about the threat." He paused. "That is a particular kind of person. Is it the kind of person you want inheriting Atlantis?" Hermione asked. Vale looked at her. She met it without adjusting anything. "No," he said, and his honesty was so clean it was almost startling. Not because you are inadequate, because you are surface-born, because you have been alive for 20 years in a world that has been using magic as a blunt instrument since the fall of this city. Because Atlantis is not a wand or a weapon or a ministry or a school, it is a civilization, and inheriting a civilization requires knowing what you're inheriting, and you have been here for less than 2 days. He leaned forward slightly. I have been here for 11,000 years. I am the last person alive who actually remembers what Atlantis was, what it could do, what it cost when it fell. He paused. I should be the one the city chooses. I am the only logical choice. The room held that statement for a moment. Harry looked at him steadily. He thought about what he'd heard in that, not the arrogance which was there but was almost beside the point, but the thing under it. The thing that had been building for 300 years of being awake and alone in an empty city that he'd kept alive through sheer sustained devotion. He thought about what that did to a person. He thought about what he himself had been like at the end of his 6th year, carrying information and responsibility that no one else could share, and what it had taken not to become something closed and hard. He thought, this man has been alone for 3 centuries, in love with a place that couldn't love him back, and the place finally called someone else. You built a case, Harry said. I have been building it for 300 years, Vale said. Then make it, Harry said. Not just the emotional argument, the actual case. Why should Atlantis choose an 11,000-year-old counselor who has spent the last 3 centuries alone in its chambers over whoever it's been measuring resonance signatures for? Vale looked at him. Then he looked at Hermione. Then he said something that was not what Harry had expected. May I sit with you, he asked. I mean that literally. May I eat with you if you're eating? I want to make my case properly, and I find that He stopped. Something crossed his face that he immediately controlled, but not before Harry caught it. Something that was fatigue and something older. It has been a very long time since I ate with someone. A silence. Sit down, Hermione said quietly. You're already sitting, but yes, stay. Vale's case, laid out over an hour of the morning, was formidable. Harry gave it that immediately and completely, because dismissing it would have been both inaccurate and stupid. And whatever else this was going to turn into, it needed to start from honest ground. The Atlantean civilization had not fallen because of external force. That was the first thing, and the thing the surface world had gotten most completely wrong in its various myths and accounts. Atlantis had not been destroyed by natural disaster or divine punishment or military defeat. It had been destroyed by succession failure, by a governing council that had made a series of decisions about who was allowed to inherit power, decisions based on bloodline and political affiliation rather than the frequency compatibility the original inheritance protocols required, and the result had been 2 generations of leaders who were brilliant and well-intentioned and fractionally misaligned with the city's resonance network. Fractionally, not dramatically. But at the level of complexity that Atlantis operated on, fractional misalignment accumulated. And after 2 generations of accumulated drift, the city's deep systems had begun to respond not catastrophically but irrevocably. The submersion had been a last-ditch stabilization, the city essentially putting itself into protective suspension before the drift reached critical failure. The city chose to sink, Hermione said. The city chose to preserve itself, Vale said. Yes. The surface world wasn't wrong that it went under, it was wrong about why. He looked at his hands on the table, those long, slightly luminous fingers with their crystalline veining. I was part of the council that authorized the final sequence of decisions that led to the drift. I was young by Atlantean standards. I voted with the majority because I trusted the majority, and I was wrong, and I have had 11,000 years to understand exactly how and why I was wrong. He looked up. Which is my qualification, not just my time here, not just my knowledge of the city's systems, my understanding of the specific failure mode that ended this civilization and my commitment to not repeating it. What specific failure mode? Harry asked. Choosing leaders by any criterion other than genuine compatibility, Vale said, which is why I object to myself actually as well as to you. He said it so flatly that it took a moment to land. I know the city better than anyone alive. I have maintained it with my own frequency for 3 centuries, but my frequency is it has been alone here for so long that it has become specific in ways that may not serve the city's future. It knows this building, it does not know the world above it. It does not know what Atlantis needs to become in order to be relevant to the world it would return to. He paused. I know this. I have known it for perhaps 100 years. I chose not to act on it because acting on it would require accepting that my 11,000 years of devotion have produced a custodian and not an heir. The silence this time was different, heavier with something more specific. Then why, Hermione said carefully, are you fighting our succession? Vale looked at her. Because knowing something rationally and accepting it fully are different things, he said, as I imagine your trial yesterday demonstrated. She held his gaze. Then she said, yes, it did. Harry watched this exchange and thought several things at once. He thought that Vale was one of the most genuinely complicated people he'd ever been in a room with, and given that his personal history included Dumbledore and Snape, that was saying something substantial. He thought that the case Vale was making against himself was probably the most honest thing anyone had said in this city since they arrived. He also thought that Vale had modified the trial settings, not once but twice, and regardless of stated justifications, that was a choice with a vector. The will trial today, Harry said. Did you modify it? A pause, brief, barely perceptible, but there. Yes, Vale said. How? The default configuration surfaces the thing you most want that you've been refusing to fully want, Vale said. My modification adds a secondary stage. The trial gives you that thing and then offers you a choice about whether to keep it. Harry looked at him. And you think we'll choose to let it go? Most people do, Vale said. Under pressure in an unfamiliar environment when what they want is something significant and having it requires admitting that they've been refusing to want it, most people retreat. They protect themselves by choosing loss over vulnerability. He met Harry's eyes. I don't know if you're most people, I suspect you're not. But the modification was designed to test that, because the city needs heirs who can claim what they want under pressure, not just endure what they're given. That's a convenient justification for something that's functionally a trap, Harry said. It's both things, Vale said. The trap and the test, they aren't mutually exclusive. Welcome to Atlantis. He spread his hand slightly, an old gesture that might once have been more elaborate. Everything here is both things. Harry considered that. Then he said, if we complete the will trial, if we complete all 3 trials, what do you do? Vale was quiet for a moment. Really quiet, the quiet of someone looking honestly at a question they've been avoiding. I don't know, he said, which is the first time in 300 years I've been in that position. He looked around the room at the walls, the glowing stone, the architecture of a world he'd kept alive alone. I have been the only voice in this city for 3 centuries. I have been right about almost everything in that time because there was no one to argue with me and I had 11,000 years of evidence and I stopped questioning my own certainty a long time ago. He looked back at them. You question everything, both of you, instinctively and relentlessly. Something moved in his face. That's actually one of the reasons the protocol chose you. I've been watching the resonance data for 300 years. I know what the protocol selects for. And yet you still objected, Hermione said. I contain contradictions, Vale said. I've had a long time to accumulate them. Harry stood up. He picked up the last of the crystal food, finished it, set the vessel down. He looked at Vale with a directness that was not aggressive and not deferential, simply the way Harry Potter looked at people when he'd decided something. I'm going to walk into the will trial this morning, he said. Whatever you've modified, I'm going to complete it. Same way I completed the memory trial, not because I'm proving something to you, but because, he paused, chose the honest words. Because whatever it shows me, I'd rather know. I've spent enough of my life not knowing things about myself because the knowing was hard. He held Vale's gaze. After we've done both trials, we'll talk again as equals. You'll tell us everything you know about this city and we'll listen to all of it. And then we'll figure out together what comes next. Vale looked at him for a long moment. Something in those crystalline eyes that was old and tired and not quite ready to hope but not quite ready to refuse to either. You're offering me a seat at the table, Vale said. After I've been sabotaging you. I'm offering you what the city should have offered you 300 years ago, Harry said. Recognition. Which is different from authority, and I think you know that, and I think part of you has known for a long time that you needed the first one and not the second. A silence with considerable weight in it. Vale stood up. He was taller than Harry, taller than he'd seemed sitting, and the full effect of 11,000 years of crystalline existence was more present when he was standing, the slight luminescence, the inhuman stillness of someone who had spent most of his existence in a state between consciousness and crystal. He was extraordinary, and he was lonely, and he was wrong in the ways that people who have been right about everything for too long always were, and Harry looked at all of that without flinching. Complete your trials, Vale said. We'll speak after. He turned to leave. Vale, Hermione said. He stopped. The city library, she said. The resonance storage in the walls. You've had 300 years of access to it. I want to know what you found. He turned back. On his face, for the first time, something that was not calculation or grief or old complicated devotion. Something that was, stripped to its core, the expression of someone who has wanted to be asked a particular question for 300 years and had stopped expecting it. That, he said, will require a great deal of time. We've got time, she said. He left. The trial of will was in a different chamber from the trial of memory, taller, with a domed ceiling like the entry chamber, the walls covered floor to dome in carved script that Hermione clocked immediately as substantially denser than anything they'd seen in the residential and civic sections. Not history or communication. Instructions. The Atlantean equivalent of a user's manual for the human heart, which Harry thought was either very prescient of them or deeply alarming, and was probably both. Solon had told them the order, Harry first, then Hermione, same as before. Harry stood at the entrance of the will chamber and looked at the interior and felt the resonance in his scar doing something that was not quite the memory trial's warning adjacent note but was in the neighborhood, something braced, purposeful. Hermione was behind him, standing with her arms folded and her weight forward, the posture of someone ready to catch something if it came at them. You heard what Vale said the modification does, she said. Gives me what I want and then asks if I'll keep it, he said. Are you going to? He turned to look at her. She was asking practically, not probing for anything, just running the tactical scenario. Know what you're going to do before you're in it. Standard Hermione Granger pre-battle logic applied to a mystical trial of the soul, which was so thoroughly her that he nearly smiled. Think I'll know what to do when I see what it shows me, he said. That's not a plan. It's the only honest answer, he said. I don't know what I want most that I've been refusing to want. If I knew, I'd have stopped refusing. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, with the specific care of someone choosing their exact words, whatever it shows you, just remember that wanting something isn't the same as being allowed to have it. Is a rule someone else invented. It's not a law. He held her gaze. Read the full meaning of what she'd said, which was layered, which she'd intended to be layered, which she then made a face that suggested she was aware she'd said more than she'd planned to. Right, he said. He walked in. The will trial started differently from the memory trial. No sensory ambush, no immediate dislocation into the past. He was standing in the chamber, walls covered in script, the resonance in his scar tuned and clear, and then the chamber simply extended. Not expanded, not changed its shape, but extended, the way a piece of music extends when you've been listening to the same phrase, and suddenly the composer adds a phrase you didn't know was coming, and everything that came before it is still there, but now there's more. And in the extension was Hermione, not a memory version, not a dream version, just her, standing in the trial space the way she stood when she decided something. Looking at him with the expression she wore when she was not performing anything at all, when it was just the two of them and whatever was real between them, which had always been. He reached for the word his brain had been avoiding for approximately 3 years, and found it this time, standing in a trial chamber 11,000 years underwater with a magical civilization pressing him toward honesty, found it the way you find a key you've been sitting on. Everything. What was real between them was everything. It had always been everything, and he had decided, at some point without making the decision consciously, that the cost of having it named was too high, that naming it was asking for something he had no business asking for, that there were enough people in his life who had been hurt by proximity to him, and she was the last one he would tolerate adding to that list. He had taken that logic and made it into something that felt like consideration but was actually, when pressed, fear. Fear that she would say no, which was bad enough. Fear that she would say yes and then something would take her, which was unsurvivable. The trial gave him Hermione, and then it waited. He was aware from the watching place above the trial that this was Vale's modification, the secondary stage, the offer of the thing, and then the choice. And he was aware that the expected move, the statistically common move that Vale had bet on, was to protect himself by releasing it, by choosing loss over vulnerability, which was the language Vale had used and which was precise enough to be insulting in its accuracy. He looked at the trial's version of Hermione and thought about what it would cost to let this go. He'd been letting it go actively, continuously for years, and every time the cost had been manageable because what he was protecting felt more important than what he was paying. But the trial had made the accounting honest, stripped the comfortable logic away, and what he was left with was this. He was afraid, and his fear was making a decision for him, and he'd looked at his own fear in the forest at 17 and kept walking anyway, and this was the same thing, different stakes, same geometry. He'd walked into the forest alone. He didn't want to make this decision alone. Trial, he said to the room, to the resonance, to whatever was listening. Can she hear me? The room hummed, not yes, not no, but he felt the shift in the resonance, the way the frequency moved when two sources were added to each other, the harmonic chord that happened whenever he and Hermione were in proximity. It was present now in the trial space, which meant she was present in some way, which meant, Hermione, he said, not loud, just her name, said the way he said it when it was just the two of them and there was nothing performing in it. A pause, then her voice from somewhere, from the resonance itself. Harry, I'm going to say something, he said, and I'm going to need you to hear it even though you're in a different room and we're in the middle of separate magical trials. All right, she said, steady. Like she was in the corridor, like she was right there. I'm not letting this go, he said. Whatever the trial is offering and then asking me to release, I'm not releasing it. I want what I've been not wanting for 3 years, which is you, which I think you might already know, which I've been afraid to say because, Harry, her voice in the resonance, steady and warm and already ahead of him the way she usually was. I know you know, he said. I'm saying it anyway. Because the trial is asking if I'll claim it under pressure, and the answer is yes, I'm claiming it. Under pressure in an impossible building, in a magical trial I'm only halfway through. I'm telling you that I know, she said again, softer. I've known since the tent, possibly longer. The tent. That freezing, miserable winter in a tent in the middle of nowhere, when it had been just the two of them and the weight of everything, and she danced with him to the radio, and it had been, he'd never had a name for what it had been. He had one now. I should have said it sooner, he said. You said it now, she said. That's enough. The trial chamber filled with light. Not the ambient blue of the city's standard resonance, something brighter, more complex, the specific light of a harmonic that had resolved after years of almost, the frequency of two sources finally tuned to each other. It passed through the walls of his chamber, and it passed through the walls of hers, and it met in the corridor between them, and the city felt it, and the resonance network registered it, and 3 levels below in his deep chambers, Erasmus Vale stood at his scrying pool and watched the light pattern, and set down the implement he'd been holding and sat down very slowly on the nearest available surface. His modification had not produced the result he'd predicted. He was discovering that this was going to be a recurring experience with these two, and he was developing a complicated relationship with the feeling. Harry came out of the trial first. The chamber's door opened and he stepped into the corridor, and there was no performance on his face because he was past performing things in this city. The trials had taken care of that efficiently, and he stood in the corridor and felt the resonance in his scar running at a frequency he'd never felt before, higher, cleaner, like a string that had been wound to the right tension for the first time. Her door opened. She walked out and they looked at each other, and there it was, named and real and not going anywhere. And she crossed the corridor in 3 steps and grabbed the front of his jacket with both hands, and the kiss was not tentative or ceremonial or a beginning. It was the kind of kiss that comes from 3 years of not kissing someone, which is its own particular category, emphatic and warm and certain. And he put his arms around her, and they stood in the corridor of Atlantis, while the city's resonance hummed around them, and everything that had been almost was finally, completely just real. When they separated, she still had his jacket in both hands and her forehead was against his and her eyes were closed, and he thought with a clarity that had nothing dreamy about it, right, of course, obviously, how did we take this long? The trial, she said, eyes still closed. Completed, he said. You. Completed? She opened her eyes. She was smiling, not her polite smile or her relieved smile or her intellectual joy smile, the real one. We should talk properly, later, when we're not in the middle of an 11,000-year-old magical inheritance trial. Yes, that, later, he agreed. Solon appeared from the end of the corridor with his slightly wrong gait and his terminal neutrality, and looked at them both with the expression of someone who has just had a hypothesis confirmed by evidence. Both trials completed, he said, again in significantly shorter duration than projected. He paused. The secondary modification to the will trial appears to have produced an unexpected outcome. Unexpected for whom? Harry said. For the person who modified it, Solon said. Not for me, I had a different projection. He looked between them, and something in his crystalline expression was unmistakably satisfaction. The third trial cannot be administered today. The city's resonance network requires time to stabilize following the dual completion. The output from both will trials simultaneously was considerable. He paused. You have today and tonight before the trial of voice. Where's Vale? Hermione asked. In his chambers, Solon said. I believe he is reconsidering several things. Good, Harry said. They walked back through the city in the warm afternoon, or what passed for afternoon, the light cycle in its middle register, the deep blue of the walls warm and steady. Hermione had her hand in his, which was practical in the way that most of the things Hermione did were practical. She decided on something and she was implementing it, no half measures, no hedge. Her other hand had her notebook. She was already writing in it. You're holding my hand and taking notes simultaneously, Harry said. I have good spatial awareness, she said without looking up. What are you writing? Observations about the resonance shift during the trial completion. The light that came through the walls, I want to cross-reference it against the frequency data from the nodes. I think the city was responding to something specific, not just to the completion of the trials, but to the content of them, and if I'm right about how the resonance storage in the walls works, you think it recorded us. I think it's been recording everything since we arrived, she said. I think the city is updating itself, learning the heirs, building, I don't know, a profile, a frequency map, something that will inform what it does next. Harry thought about that, the city learning them. 11,000 years of information waiting, and now the process of adding 2 more people's worth to it. Does that bother you? He asked. She looked at him. Being known by a city, being known that completely by anything. She thought about it honestly. No, she said. I spent a long time being afraid of being misread, of people deciding who I was before they'd understood what they were deciding. This, she looked at the walls, the breathing stone, the deep blue pulse of something ancient and patient. This isn't deciding, this is listening. She paused. I find that I don't mind being listened to. He squeezed her hand. She went back to her notebook. Somewhere in the city's walls, the resonance network recorded this too, the exact frequency of 2 people learning together, that the world was stranger and larger and more willing to receive them than they'd been told, and finding that they preferred it that way. They found Vale at the acoustic node in the residential district, the open plaza space where Harry had sat the day before. He was standing at its center with his back to them and his hands at his sides, perfectly still in the way that only worked if you'd spent 10 millennia as something more crystal than flesh. They stopped at the edge of the plaza. The resonance hummed between them. You completed the will trial, Vale said without turning. We did, Harry said. My modification didn't produce the expected outcome. It produced an unexpected one, Hermione said. Which is arguably better depending on what you were actually trying to achieve. Vale turned. He looked at them, at their hands, which were still joined, and something passed through his face that was very old and very specific, a recognition that had grief in it but not bitterness. The grief of someone who has been alone for a very long time, seeing what they've been alone without. I was trying to prove you were wrong for this, he said. I was trying to show the city that surface-born heirs would crack under pressure, choose safety over claim, retreat from difficulty. And instead, Harry said, and instead you appear to be exactly what the protocol said you were, Vale said. He sounded, not for the first time, like someone in the process of revising a position they'd held for centuries and finding it goes faster than expected once you've decided to do it honestly. Which means I've spent 300 years being the only voice in this city and I've made an error. Not in my maintenance of the city is intact, the systems are functional, the resonance network is stable, but in my understanding of what the city was for. He paused. I kept it alive, I forgot what I was keeping it alive for. What were you keeping it alive for? Hermione asked. He was quiet for a moment. Standing in the acoustic node of his 11,000-year-old civilization, the man who had watched it fall and chosen to stay with it rather than let it be simply lost, and the answer to her question was so obvious that the asking of it was what made it land. For this, he said, for when someone came. He said it like a man setting something down that had been very heavy for a very long time. Then help us, Harry said. You know this city the way no one alive knows it. That's not wasted, and it doesn't end when we take the third trial. It changes what it's for. He met Vale's eyes. You said the city needs heirs who understand what they're inheriting. You're part of what we're inheriting. You're the memory of this place in ways the resonance walls can't capture. That means you're part of the succession, not outside it. Vale looked at him for a very long time with the crystalline stillness of someone who has just been offered something they stopped believing was possible so gradually and completely that they hadn't noticed the belief disappearing. Then the city shuddered, not metaphorically. The ground moved, a precise, deep vibration, nothing geological, something systemic, rising from somewhere well below their current depth, the kind of movement that the resonance network made when one of its major load-bearing matrices was being stressed. The walls flickered. The ambient light dropped by a third and then recovered. In the acoustic node, the standing harmonic went briefly chaotic, 2 or 3 seconds of resonant noise, frequencies clashing rather than combining before the node's own architecture reasserted order. Solon appeared in the plaza entrance at a speed that was not quite compatible with his usual unhurried gait. Something has been triggered in the deep systems, he said. Specifically, the emergency preservation failsafe, the protocol that was used to execute the original submersion. His eyes went to Vale, not accusatory, precise. Not me, Vale said immediately. I know what that sounds like, it wasn't me. Then what? Harry asked. It is the most likely answer, Solon said, and for the first time since they'd met him, Harry heard something in Solon's voice that was not dry or measured or professionally calibrated. It was the voice of something very old being genuinely afraid, that the failsafe activated itself. What does that mean? Hermione asked. It means, Solon said, that the city does not believe its succession is secure. He looked at the walls, the flickering pulse. The trial of voice has not been completed, the heirs are not confirmed, and the city's self-preservation instinct, the same instinct that chose to submerge rather than be corrupted 11,000 years ago, is beginning to assess whether it needs to act again. The light went down, came back, down, back. A pulse now irregular, not the smooth respiratory cycle they'd been living with, but the heartbeat of something under stress. What does it do? Harry said. If it decides to act. The original submersion protocol brought the city to the floor of the North Atlantic, Solon said. If it executes again from this depth, it goes deeper, Hermione said. It goes to a depth from which, Solon said, neither of you would be able to exit. The pressure at that depth would overwhelm any surface-borne protective charm. The city would be preserved, you would be inside it. Harry looked at Hermione. She was already thinking, pen in her hand, notebook closed, the specific intense focus of someone rapidly working through a scenario. The trial of voice, she said. If we complete it, the succession is confirmed and the failsafe stands down, Solon said. Yes, then we do it now, Harry said. It cannot be administered today, the resonance network requires. The resonance network, Harry said with a calm that was entirely genuine and perhaps the single most self-assured sentence he'd spoken in this city, has been running 2 separate will trials simultaneously, and it just registered enough resonant output to show up in both our trial chambers at once. It's not depleted, it's more active than it's been in 11,000 years. He looked at Solon. You said the network requires time to stabilize. I'm saying it doesn't need to be stable for the trial of voice. I'm saying whatever we're going to do, we need to do it before the city decides we're not here and puts itself somewhere unreachable. Solon looked at him. His crystalline eyes held the light from the flickering walls and held Harry's gaze with something that might in a human face have been wonder. You understand the city better than you should for 2 days of residence, Solon said. I've been listening, Harry said. Take us to the voice trial. Solon looked at Vale. Vale looked at Harry and Hermione, at the two of them standing in the acoustic node of his city with the walls going irregular around them, calm and purposeful and entirely unafraid, and something in his ancient face completed a journey it had been on since breakfast. Go, Vale said. I'll manage the preservation failsafe from the secondary system access point. I can hold it for 2 hours, possibly 3. After that it escalates beyond manual override. 2 hours is enough, Hermione said. How do you know? Vale asked. She looked at him with an absolute clarity. Because it's going to be enough, she said. That's all. Vale almost smiled. It was the beginning of one, at least, the slight shift of a face that had forgotten the mechanics and was remembering them slowly. Go, he said again. Both of you, go. They went. Chapter 5. The girl who shouldn't have been there. The corridor to the trial of voice was different from the corridors that led to the other 2 trials, and Harry noticed this the way he'd learned to notice things in this city. Not by looking directly at what was different, but by feeling it in his scar, the resonance shifting the way music shifts when a key changes. The walls here were smoother. less carved, less dense with script. As though the city had decided that this particular approach needed to be quiet rather than instructive, needed to give you room to arrive rather than filling you up on the way. Solon moved ahead of them quickly, quicker than his usual pace. The city's pulse had settled into something irregular but not escalating. Harry had been monitoring it the way he monitored his own breathing, the kind of awareness that didn't require thought, just ran underneath everything else. Vale's intervention at the secondary system was holding. They had time, not infinite time, but enough time if they were honest about what enough meant. The trial of voice, Hermione said, walking beside him close enough that their arms were in contact. You said it requires a frequency neither of us generates independently. Correct, Solon said without turning, and together we generate it. You have been generating it since you arrived, Solon said. The harmonic between your resonance signatures is the frequency the trial requires. You simply need to focus it, consciously, deliberately, with intention. The city needs to hear it clearly, not as background radiation between two people standing in proximity, but as a statement. A statement of what? Harry asked. Solon paused at a junction, turned to look at them both. Of claim, he said. The trial of voice is not a test of what you are. The memory trial tested what you've been. The will trial tested what you want. The voice trial asks what you choose. He held Harry's eyes and then Hermione's. Atlantis does not want inheritors who were chosen and complied. It wants inheritors who choose back, who look at what they're being offered, all of it, the history, the weight, the responsibility, the complexity, the counselor in the deep chambers who spent 3 centuries trying to prove them unworthy and choose it anyway, consciously, loudly. He turned back to the corridor. The trial asked you to say yes. To the city, Hermione said. To everything the city means, Solon said. To each other as partners in the succession, to the work, to what comes after. Harry thought about that. He thought about what yes had meant in various contexts of his life, the yes that was expected of him, the yes that was a form of obedience, the yes that had been trained into him from childhood as the only safe response. Then he thought about the yes that was a choice. The yes he'd said at 11 getting on the Hogwarts Express. The yes he'd said at 17 walking into the forest. Neither of those had been compelled, neither had been obedience, both had cost something and been worth it. All right, he said. Also, Solon said with a slight shift in his delivery that Harry had come to recognize as the Solon equivalent of hesitance, there is a complication. Of course there was. There is someone in the trial chamber, Solon said. The trial chamber was the largest space they'd seen in Atlantis. It made the entry chamber look modest, a vaulted space that rose to a ceiling so distant it was more suggested than visible, a space the size of a cathedral but with none of a cathedral's deliberate grandeur, because its scale wasn't about impressing anyone. It was functional, built to the exact dimensions required to contain and sustain a full resonant frequency at the level the trial of voice operated on. The walls were covered entirely in the Atlantean script, floor to ceiling, not carved but grown, the letters expanding organically from the crystal matrices as though the stone were writing them continuously. The acoustic geometry of the space was immediately physically apparent. Harry felt it in his chest the moment they entered, that deep low organ note sensation, the city's resonance at its fullest and most concentrated. And in the center of the chamber, sitting on the floor with her knees pulled up and her arms wrapped around them and her eyes very wide, was a girl. She was perhaps 14, dark hair, olive skin, wearing clothes that were thoroughly muggle, jeans, a green jacket, trainers with a tear in the left toe. She had a rucksack beside her that had apparently been repacked recently because the zipper was slightly off track in the way of something closed in a hurry. She was looking at them with an expression that managed to be simultaneously frightened, defiant, and so comprehensively relieved to see another human face that the relief was winning by several lengths. Harry and Hermione stopped. The girl looked at them, they looked at the girl. Hi, the girl said in slightly accented English. Eastern European, Harry thought, possibly Balkan. Hi, Harry said. Are you real? She asked. Yes, Hermione said. Are you all right? Are you hurt? No. She unfolded slightly. Not hurt, I have been here for, she thought. I think 2 days, the time is strange here, there is no sun. There's a light cycle, Hermione said, already crossing toward her. It simulates dawn and evening through the resonance network. If you've been here 2 days, you'd have seen it shift 4 times. She knelt down to the girl's level without making it a production, checking her face and hands for any sign of injury. What's your name? Petra, the girl said. Petra Vazic. She looked at Hermione with a flicker of recognition. You are, I have seen your photograph, you are the muggle-born witch from the war. I'm Hermione Granger, Hermione said. Petra's eyes moved to Harry. The recognition there was immediate and complicated, the expression Harry had seen 10,000 times, the one that knew his face from a context that had nothing to do with him as an actual person. He'd learned not to mind it. Sometimes he'd even learned to use the moment of it to say something true before the mythology had finished assembling itself. Harry Potter, he said. How did you get here, Petra? She looked down at her hands. They were bare, cold-looking. I do not know the exact mechanism, she said, with the careful precision of someone who has been thinking about how to explain something that doesn't have good words. I am from Albania, near Sh Koder. I am a pause, a decision. I am a squib, she said. It came out with the braced quality of something usually said defensively, and now being said to people she hoped might not require the defense. My family is magical, my parents, my sister, my grandmother, all of them. I am the only one without. She stopped. Without a wand, Harry said. Without any of it, Petra said. I have never done magic, not once, but 3 weeks ago I started to hear something. I know that sounds. No, Hermione said immediately. It doesn't sound anything, tell us. Petra looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone being offered something they're not quite sure is on offer for them. Then she continued. A sound not with my ears here. She pressed 2 fingers to her sternum. A frequency, it was like a radio signal that you cannot quite tune. It got stronger over 3 weeks, and then one night I was by the lake near our town. The lake has a deep place, very cold even in summer, and I went to the water and the frequency was very strong and there was a light from below the surface and I went into the water and she gestured at the chamber around them. I was here, in this room. You swam in? Harry asked. I do not think I swam, she said. I think the city brought me. He looked up at the carved walls, the vast ceiling, the script moving through the stone. I think it made a door for me. Solon had been standing in the chamber entrance and Harry turned to look at him now. Solon's expression was the most complicated Harry had seen it, layers of calculation and something that was not quite surprise but had surprise's shape. She's correct, Solon said. He walked into the chamber, looking at Petra with an attention that was thorough and slightly unnerving in its totality. The city made a direct resonance door, a tertiary channel not part of the standard inheritance protocol. It has not been used in. He stopped. It has not been used before in any record I have access to. A channel for what? Hermione asked. She's a squib. She doesn't have a magical signature. She does not have a wand-type magical signature, Solon said. She has a resonance signature. They are not the same thing. He crouched in front of Petra, which was a sight Harry found quietly extraordinary, the ancient crystalline intelligence of Atlantis getting down to a 14-year-old girl's eye level with the solemnity of someone about to say something important. You have never done magic, Solon said to her, but you hear frequencies. Yes, Petra said, since birth, since I was small but very faint, I thought everyone heard them. Not everyone hears them, Solon said. Almost no one hears them. It is not a magical sense in any conventional classification. It is considerably rarer. He looked at Harry and Hermione. Atlantean frequency sensitivity is not related to standard magical capacity. It is a separate inheritance. The city classified her as a squib because she cannot use a wand, but the city's own protocol doesn't measure wand capacity. It measures resonance. He paused. She is not a squib in any sense this city recognizes. She is precisely the kind of frequency-sensitive individual that Atlantis was built by and built for. Petra was looking at Solon with an expression that Harry read as someone having a foundational belief about themselves revised in real time, which was a specific look he recognized from his own mirror. Not joy yet, not quite. The careful, disbelieving approach to something you've been told could never be yours. Are you telling me, Petra said slowly, that this city, she gestured again at the impossible space around them, this city brought me here because I belong here. I'm telling you the city recognized your signature and opened a door, Solon said. What that means in terms of belonging is something you'll have to decide yourself. He stood up. However, your presence here is not incidental, and the timing, he looked at Harry and Hermione. The timing is not coincidental. Your arrival 2 days ago coincided with the heirs' arrival. The trial of voice requires a specific frequency. That frequency requires both heirs generating it together. We know, Harry said. What you don't know, Solon said, is that the frequency also requires a receiver. Silence. A receiver, Hermione said. The frequency generated by 2 heirs in resonance is not a small thing, Solon said. In the city's original design, the trial of voice was always witnessed by the full Atlantean population. 1,000 people at minimum in this chamber. The heirs generate the frequency, the population receives it, and the act of transmission and reception simultaneously confirms the succession and distributes the connection to the city across the new inheritors and the community they're inheriting for. He looked at them. The city has been empty for 11,000 years. There is no population to receive. Without a receiver, the frequency generates and has nowhere to land, and the trial cannot complete. Harry looked at Petra. Petra looked back at him. She'd understood before he'd finished. She was fast, Harry noted. The look on her face was not overwhelmed, it was processing. I am the receiver, she said. You are frequency sensitive to a degree that I have not recorded in any individual in my data, Solon said. You heard the city's calling signal from 3 miles of depth and 800 miles of lateral distance in your sleep over 3 weeks. You followed it to its source with no magical training, no guidance and no map. He paused. You are precisely what the trial needs. In a chamber of 1,000 Atlanteans, you'd have been the clearest receiver in the room. In a chamber of 1 you are enough, Petra said, not arrogant, certain. I am enough. Yes, Solon said, you are. Harry and Hermione stood at the chamber's center with Petra seated 12 feet in front of them, cross-legged on the floor, her rucksack to one side, her hands on her knees with a stillness that was different from how she'd been sitting when they'd arrived, no longer frightened, no longer braced, but settled, like someone who has just been told what they're for and discovered that it matches something they already knew about themselves. The city was still doing its irregular pulse. Harry could feel it through the floor. Vale's secondary system hold was working, but not indefinitely, a clock running underneath everything at a frequency just below what the ears could catch. What do we do? Harry asked Solon. Generate the frequency, Solon said. Consciously, you've been doing it passively since you arrived. The passive version is what kept the resonance network active, what completed the trials, what the city has been registering as confirmation of air presence. For the trial of voice, it needs to be deliberate. You need to both reach for it at the same time with full attention with the intent of claiming the succession. He paused. It will feel like, he seemed to run out of analogies, it will feel like something that doesn't have a comparison. That's remarkably unhelpful, Hermione said, but without heat. I know, Solon said. I am sorry, I have seen this trial attempted twice in my existence and completed once. The description I was given by the heir who completed it was simply that it felt true. Harry looked at Hermione, she looked at him. They'd been standing close together, but now she turned to face him directly and he turned to face her, and they were close enough that he could see the blue of the chamber light in her eyes and the particular set of her expression, which was not ceremonial or performative or afraid. She was present. Completely, specifically present, the way she was in the best moments of the worst situations, that capacity she had for being fully in the moment when the moment required it, which he had always trusted more completely than he'd ever trusted anything else. Ready, he said. Since you asked, she said, I've been ready for about 3 years. He smiled, she smiled, and then they both reached for it. It was not like casting. That was the first thing Harry registered, the complete absence of the will through medium mechanics that underpinned every spell he'd ever performed. Casting was reaching for something and pulling it through. This was different. This was becoming receptive to something that was already there, already running, had been running between them since the first morning they'd both felt the vibration and met each other's eyes in McGonagall's antechamber. It was already there. It had always been there. The trial was just asking them to stop not noticing it. He felt her frequency before he felt his own. That was the strange thing, that his awareness went outward first. He felt the specific resonance of her, the signature that the city had been measuring and that he now understood was not magical in any standard sense, but was her, the frequency of Hermione Granger's presence in the world, the particular way she occupied space and thought and cared and fought and chose, rendered in something that the city could read and that he could feel in his chest and his hands and the mark on his forehead. He felt it and he held it and he let it be what it was without translating it. And then he felt her feeling his. That was the circuit closing. That was the harmonic, not two frequencies running side by side but two frequencies hearing each other, responding, adjusting, resolving into the chord that the city had been waiting for. Not loud, not explosive. Clean, the way resolution in music is clean, the moment when the tension interval finally steps to the consonants and the ear recognizes it as inevitable. Yes, that, of course, there it is. He heard her catch her breath. He was doing the same. The frequency built between them, not by effort but by permission, by both of them stopping holding it back, which was the only thing that had ever required effort in the first place. The holding back, the not quite saying, the 3 years of almost. Letting that go was not dramatic. It was quiet and complete, and it felt, as Solon's second-hand description had said it would feel, completely true. The chamber walls responded. The script carved into the stone began to glow. Not the ambient blue-white of the city's standard resonance, something warmer, more complex, the light of the frequency itself rendered visible, moving through the stone the way bioluminescence moves through deep water, spreading from the center of the chamber outward to the walls and upward to the ceiling, writing itself across the city's architecture in lines of warm light that had the quality of something being spoken. Petra made a sound. Harry was aware of her in his peripheral attention, not fully watching, the trial requiring his focus, but enough to register that she was sitting very straight with her eyes wide open and her hands flat on the stone floor, and her expression was the specific expression of someone hearing something clearly for the first time, something they've been catching fragments of their entire life, and the clarity of it was overwhelming in the way that clarity always is after long confusion. Overwhelming and undeniably specifically right. She wasn't receiving passively, she was resonating. Her own frequency, the one the city had been identifying for 3 weeks and had opened a door across 800 miles to reach, was responding to theirs, not matching it, not combining with it, doing something more precise than either of those, something that was the receiver's function in an acoustic system, the part that takes the signal and reflects it back, stabilized and amplified and landed. She was the ground under the frequency. She was the place it touched down, the city knew. Harry felt it, the deep systemic shift, the thing that happened when a very large and very complex system recognized that all its conditions had been met. Not a bang, a settling, like a building's foundations after a long tremor finding their true rest. The irregular pulse in the floor evened out. The light cycle, which had been flickering since the failsafe activated, went smooth and steady. The ambient resonance came back to its full 45-second cycle, but with a new quality in it, fuller, richer, harmonically expanded from what it had been since they arrived, as though it had been running on reduced capacity for 11,000 years and had just been given permission to run complete. Somewhere in the deep chambers, the preservation failsafe stood down. And 3 levels below, Erasmus Vale felt the shift through his hands on the secondary system controls, and he stood back from the console, and he stood in his chamber alone for a moment, and then he sat down on the floor, the actual floor, not ceremonially, just physically, because sitting was the honest response to what he was feeling, and put his face in his hands, not in grief, not exactly. in something that was what grief became when it finally found its resolution. Something that had been waiting for an ending for a very long time, and the ending had arrived, and it was both worse and better than he'd expected, and he was going to need a moment. He took the moment. When the light finished its expansion through the chamber walls and settled into the new steady warmth of the post-trial resonance, Harry and Hermione separated, not physically, they stayed close, his hand finding hers again with the automatic ease of something already habitual, and looked at the chamber around them. The script on the walls was still glowing, not all of it. Specific sections, lines and passages lit in warm gold against the crystal stone. "What is it saying?" Harry asked. "It's the succession record," Hermione said. She was looking at the walls with her head tilted, that particular alignment that meant she was reading rather than just looking. "These passages, I can read some of them, more than I could this morning. The trial completion has accelerated the language acquisition, just like Solon said." She walked toward the nearest wall, pulling Harry with her, and he watched her face as she read. The expression she wore was quiet and concentrated, and then it changed into something softer. "It's Harry, it's listing the previous heirs, the Atlantean succession going back to the city's founding. There are names here, dates not in any calendar system I know but consistent. The intervals between them suggest hundreds of years in some cases, shorter in others. The protocol activated when the previous heirs' resonance patterns completed." She traced the script without touching, following it upward. "All of them, and then here at the bottom, here," she stopped. Harry looked at the bottom of the nearest column of script. 2 new lines, the ink of them still warm, the newest marks in a record that stretched back 11,000 years. He couldn't read them fully yet. His Atlantean acquisition was slower than hers. He'd been doing less direct language work and more environmental reception. But he could feel them, the same way he could feel his own name in any context, the resonance of the city saying, "These ones here, these two now. It's us," he said. "It's us," she agreed. They stood at the bottom of the oldest succession record in human history and looked at their own names, glowing warm and new in the light of a city that had been waiting for them for 11,000 years, and it was not solemn in the way Harry might have expected. It was just real, specific and solid and real, the way the best things were. Petra appeared beside them, standing with her rucksack on one shoulder, looking at the wall with eyes that were still very bright. "And me," she said, practical. She'd been born into a family that had magic and been told she didn't, and she'd spent her whole life learning to ask for what was actually true rather than what was convenient. Solon came to stand beside her. He looked at the wall for a moment, then he looked at Harry and Hermione. "The receiver of the succession frequency," Solon said carefully, "in the original Atlantean tradition was not a passive role. The population that received the trial frequency became connected. Not to the city's governance, to the city itself, to its resonance network at the level of passive sensitivity." He looked at Petra. "One receiver in 10,000 might already be frequency sensitive to the degree you are. In the history of this city, such a receiver was not simply a witness. They were a bridge," Petra said. She'd gotten there first, between the heirs and the city and the world. "Yes," Solon said. "That is what I am for," Petra said. She said it without drama, just the honest satisfaction of a person who has spent their entire life being defined by what they lacked and has just discovered that the defining was wrong. "That is what you are for," Solon said. Harry looked at the girl who wasn't supposed to be here, who'd followed a frequency across the floor of the North Atlantic from Albania, who'd sat alone in the most important room in the oldest civilization on Earth for 2 days without breaking. He thought about the kind of person who did that. "Petra," he said, "when we're done here, when we've sorted out what comes next, we'd like you to stay if you want to." She looked at him, looked at Hermione, looked at the walls and the light and the city breathing around them. "My family thinks I am visiting my cousin in Belgrade," she said. "We can sort the timing," Hermione said. "We're good at logistics." "My sister will cover for me for perhaps 1 more week," Petra said, and something in her face was fighting a smile. "She does not know where I am, but she knows I am not in Belgrade." 1 week, Harry said. "That's enough to start." The city's pulse was steady now, warm and full and running clean for the first time since they'd arrived. Harry felt it in his scar like a resolved chord. Beside him, Hermione had let go of his hand only to open her notebook, and he was learning already that this was its own form of closeness, the way she carried her attention between him and the next thing, giving both their full measure. Then the chamber shuddered, not the even vibration of the failsafe standing down, different, directional, coming from a specific level below them. Harry's scar went sharp. Beside him, Hermione's head came up. Petra scrambled to her feet. Solon turned toward the chamber entrance with an urgency that from Solon was equivalent to someone else sprinting. "That," Solon said, "is the deep chamber matrix, level 7. His voice had gone to its most stripped-down register. "Vale is accessing the primary preservation system, not the secondary, the primary." "I thought the failsafe stood down," Harry said. "The automatic failsafe did," Solon said. "This is not the automatic failsafe." He looked at Harry. "This is a manual override. Something that requires direct physical access to the level 7 controls and a counselor-level frequency key." He paused. "The succession is confirmed. The trials are complete. He has no legitimate reason to access the primary system." "Then why is he?" Hermione asked. Solon was quiet for a second in a way that was different from his usual considered pauses. This was the quiet of someone who has run a calculation and doesn't like the result. Because the succession confirmation, Solon said slowly, changes what the city is, what it belongs to. For 300 years, Erasmus Vale has been the only consciousness in this city. The city's resonance network has been calibrated functionally around his single frequency. When the succession confirms, he stopped. The network recalibrates to the heirs, not just partially, fully. The city is now yours, not his. Another pause. He knew this would happen. He has known it his entire time here, and he has spent 3 centuries telling himself he was at peace with it. Solon looked at the floor. He is discovering that he is not. The shudder came again, deeper this time with a quality that Harry's scar registered as different from the structural vibrations they'd been feeling, not systemic, not distributed through the whole network, but concentrated, intentional, targeted. What does the primary system do that the automatic failsafe doesn't? Harry asked, and he asked it at exactly the speed of someone who already had a reasonable guess and wanted confirmation before they moved. The automatic failsafe submerges, Solon said. The primary system, he looked at the walls, the ceiling, the chamber they were standing in with its 11,000-year history written in glowing script. The primary system can unmake the resonance network. Selectively, it can remove specific frequencies from the matrices. He met Harry's eyes. If Vale removes your frequency signatures from the network before the resonance anchor fully sets, the succession confirmation doesn't hold, Hermione said. The trial results would still be on record, the succession would technically be confirmed, but the city would not know you. Without your frequencies in the network, you would be confirmed heirs in documentation and nothing else. The city would run on its last stable calibration. Solon paused. Which is Vale's frequency, his alone. For 300 years, Harry was already moving. Was level 7, he said. South corridor 3 levels down, the access stair is Petra, Harry said, turning back. Stay here, do not leave this chamber. Petra looked at him with the expression of someone who has been told to stay put their entire life and has developed a complicated relationship with the instruction. Why? Because the city recognizes your frequency now, Harry said. You're the active receiver. If anything goes wrong with the resonance network while we're on level 7, Solon is going to need someone in this chamber to anchor the signal, someone frequency sensitive. She looked at him for a second. That is not just a reason to keep me safe, she said. No, he said, it's also true. She sat back down. Go, she said, I will anchor the signal. Harry and Hermione went. The south corridor ran steep and the staircase to level 7 was narrow, carved into the living rock below the city's main structures, clearly not designed for frequent access, a maintenance channel rather than a thoroughfare. The air changed as they descended, colder, denser, the crystal light thinner here, the ambient glow of the resonance network reduced because these were the deep foundations, the parts of the city that ran at the baseload frequency rather than the full register. Harry's scar was sharp and clear and he was following it like a compass needle. Vale, Hermione said as they descended, her voice low and clipped, doesn't actually want to destroy the succession. He told us himself he knows the city needs new heirs. He knows his frequency has become too specific, too isolated. He knows it rationally, Harry said. And emotionally he's watching 300 years of being the only thing in this city get replaced in the span of 2 days. She wasn't making excuses, just mapping the terrain. He's not operating from malice, he's operating from grief that moved faster than he was ready for. I know, Harry said, that's why we're not sending Solon. She glanced at him. You planned that, 2 seconds of planning, he said. But yes, she almost smiled. Then, he has access to systems we don't understand yet. If he activates the frequency removal before we reach him, then we'll fix it afterward, Harry said. Solon said the trial results would still be on record. The documentation stands. We'd have to re-establish the resonance anchor, but the succession would still be legally confirmed. Can we re-establish the resonance anchor? We just generated a frequency that lit up the biggest room in Atlantis and registered on a receiver in a 14-year-old girl with no formal magical training who heard us from Albania, Harry said. Yes, I think we can re-establish the anchor. She was quiet for a beat. I love that you said that without a single qualifier. I'm working on not qualifying things unnecessarily, he said. You can tell, she said, and her voice was warm in a way that was new and not new, the warmth of something said without the cover of plausible deniability. And he found it settled something in him precisely the way the trial's resolution had settled the city. The staircase ended. Level 7 was not what Harry had expected. He'd been bracing for something dramatic, a vast machine room, a chamber full of the crystal control systems, something that looked like the operational guts of a civilization. Instead it was small, almost humble, a room perhaps 20 feet across with walls that were entirely crystal matrix, not the architectural decorative crystal of the upper levels but functional crystal deep in the stone, the actual physical substrate of the resonance network. It pulsed with slow light. It felt standing in it like standing inside something alive and paying very close attention to you. Vale was at the far wall with both hands pressed flat against the crystal. His eyes were closed. His expression was the expression of someone doing something they have talked themselves into and are still, even mid-act, not entirely certain about. Around his hands, the crystal matrices were shifting. Frequency patterns moving, adjusting, responding to his touch with the fluency of a 300-year relationship. Harry could see it, not see exactly, feel in his scar the way the network was being handled. It was careful, it was precise, and it was almost certainly wrong. Harry walked into the room and stopped 8 feet from Vale and said his name. Vale's eyes opened. He looked at Harry. He kept his hands on the wall. "You completed the trial," he said. "We completed the trial," Harry said. "The city confirmed you." Vale's voice had a quality in it that was not quite stable. "I felt it from level 7, the network shift, the recalibration." He looked at his own hands against the crystal. 300 years. I have been the only frequency in this network for 300 years. When it recalibrated, he stopped. "What did it feel like?" Harry asked. Vale looked at him for a moment. "Like being removed," he said. "I know that is not what happened. I know the recalibration doesn't erase me. My frequency is still in the network, still part of the record. But the weight of it changed, the primacy of it. I have been," he exhaled, a sound that was not quite a breath and not quite something else. "I have been the loudest thing in this building for 3 centuries, and then in the space of 1 afternoon I was not." "And you came down here," Harry said. "I came down here," Vale said. He looked at the wall. His hands hadn't moved. "I came down here and I told myself I was conducting maintenance. I have conducted maintenance on level 7 300 times in 300 years. There is always maintenance." He paused. "I did not begin the frequency removal. I want you to know that. I accessed the system. I placed my hands, and then I could not begin. Because you knew it was wrong," Hermione said. She was standing just behind Harry's shoulder, and her voice was quiet and direct, without accusation. "Because I knew it was wrong," Vale said. "Yes, I have known a great many things for a very long time and acted on almost all of them and been right about almost all of them, and the exceptions have all been the same exception, the place where knowing and feeling diverge, where the rational position and the emotional one are different." He looked at Harry. "You knew that about me from this morning. That's why you came down yourself rather than sending the custodial intelligence." "Solon could have shut down level 7 access remotely once the succession was confirmed," Harry said. "I know he could. He told me he could when he was briefing me on the system. He also told me there was a manual override that predated his administrative authority." He held Vale's gaze. "I didn't ask him to shut it down because you coming down here wasn't an attack. It was a person having a very hard day, and shutting down the access would have been managing you. I'm not interested in managing you." Vale removed his hands from the wall. He turned to face them fully. In the crystal light of level 7 he looked not older than he had upstairs. The crystalline quality didn't map onto aging in any visual way, but more stripped, more arrived at. As though the layers of 300 years of alone certainty had thinned to something closer to the actual person underneath. "I have been a counselor of Atlantis since I was 28 years old," he said. "I have been one for 11,000 years. It is not just what I do, it is what I am." He looked around the chamber at the crystal walls, the resonance network, the deep foundations of the city he'd given everything to. "If I am not the primary frequency in this network, I do not know what I am." "You're the person who remembers," Hermione said. "Everything the walls store in frequency, you know it as experience. You were there. You lived through the fall. You made the decision to stay. You know what this city was in ways the resonance record can't fully convey, because some things don't translate into frequency, they stay in people." She stepped forward. "That is not a lesser thing, Vale. That is not a consolation. The city's living memory walking around in its corridors is not a footnote to the succession, it's part of what we're inheriting." Vale looked at her. "You said that this morning," he said. "At breakfast, you offered me a seat at the table." "I said it this morning and I mean it now," Harry said. "The table got more real between then and now, but the offer didn't change." Something moved through Vale's face, slow, like a geological process, something shifting at depth that produces surface expression over time. It was not joy, it was not relief in any simple sense. It was something older and more specific, the feeling of a wall held against a flood for so long that the person holding it has forgotten they're holding it, and then someone else arrives and helps hold it, and the muscles can finally not release but share. "You are going to need to learn the full history," Vale said. "Not just the resonance record, the oral record, what I remember." "Yes," Harry said. "That will take time, a great deal of time." "Good," Hermione said. "I was hoping it would take a long time." Vale looked between them. Then he looked at the crystal wall behind him, at his own handprints warm on the matrix surface, still showing the slightly elevated resonance of where he'd been pressing. "There is a room on level 4, he said. "I have been calling it the archive chamber in my own notation, but its Atlantean name translates as approximately the place where the remembered go." He stepped back from the wall. "I can show you if you want to begin." "We want to begin," Harry said. They left level 7 together. On the way up the narrow staircase, Vale walked ahead and Harry and Hermione followed, and neither of them said anything, but Hermione's shoulder pressed briefly against Harry's in the staircase's tight dimensions, and he pressed back, and the city's pulse ran steady and full through the walls around them. All 3 of their frequencies now, the 2 heirs and the counselor, 3 notes in the network that had been running on one for 300 years. The sound of it, if anyone in the city had been there to hear, was the sound of a chord completing after a very long time being held as a single sustained note. Upstairs in the trial of voice chamber, Petra Vasic sat cross-legged on the floor with both hands flat on the crystal stone, Feeling the city breathe through her palms, her face turned up to the inscribed ceiling with an expression that was peaceful and certain and utterly at home, in a place that everyone in her life would have said had nothing to do with her. She could feel them coming back up the stairs. All three of them, the heirs and the old counselor, something resolving in the frequency between them that she registered clearly even before she heard footsteps. She smiled, picked up her rucksack, got ready, the work was beginning. Chapter 6, Heirs of What Was Lost. The archive chamber on level 4 was not a room that announced itself. Harry had walked past its entrance twice in their first day without registering it as anything other than a recessed section of wall, the stone slightly different in color, the carved script above the lintel denser and older looking than the surrounding architecture, but not dramatically so. Nothing in Atlantis was dramatic for its own sake. That was one of the things Harry had stopped noticing because he'd started accepting it, the way you stop noticing the smell of a place once you've been in it long enough for your senses to classify it as home. Vale pressed one palm flat against the lintel script and held it there for 3 seconds. The wall inhaled, that was the only word for it, a deep inward movement of the stone, the way a chest expands before speech, and then the entrance opened, wider than it appeared from outside, into a room that made Hermione stop in the doorway with both hands gripping the frame. It was full of light. Not the ambient crystal blue of the city's standard resonance, but warm, differentiated light, each source distinct, coming from objects that lined the walls on shelves of the same crystal veined stone, hundreds of them, thousands possibly, objects of varying size and material and age, each one glowing with its own specific frequency, its own color in the light spectrum, making the room into something that was part storage and part constellation. The ceiling above them had more of the script, but written differently here, in a hand that was not carved but deposited, as though someone had pressed words into the stone the way you'd press a seal into wax, with heat and intention. Everything in this room, Vale said, walking in with the ease of someone who has spent centuries in a space, is a record, not the frequency type, physical record. Objects that carry history in their material, in their construction, in what was done with them. The city's resonance walls store information as frequency. This room stores it as artifact. He moved to the nearest shelf, touched the edge of an object Harry couldn't fully identify, a curved piece of something that might have been bone or might have been the same crystal material as the walls, shaped into a bowl or a vessel of some kind, glowing a deep amber. This was the founding council's water vessel, used in the city's first frequency alignment ceremony 11,000 years ago. 6 counselors, the city's first heirs, standing in the trial of voice chamber for the first time. He looked at Harry. The frequency they generated is still in its material, it remembers. How many objects? Hermione asked. She was already moving into the room, hands at her sides with a discipline that cost her visibly. She wanted to touch everything. She wasn't touching anything until she understood the rules. I have catalogued 4,712, Vale said. There are sections of the shelving I have not been able to fully access because the objects predate my time in the city, and their frequency keys are not in my range. He looked at Petra, who had followed them up from the trial chamber with the settled confidence of someone who has stopped waiting to be invited to things. They may be in hers. Petra walked to the far shelf without ceremony, crouched in front of it, and put her hand 3 inches from the nearest object, a flat disc of dark material that was very old, the oldest-looking thing in the room, its glow faint and deep and slow like a pulse at the edge of perception. She didn't touch it, she just held her hand near it. Her eyes went slightly unfocused. It's speaking, she said. Can you understand it? Harry asked. Not words, she said, feeling. It is very old, and it is proud, and it is glad someone is near it. She looked up at Vale. How long has it been since anyone came into this room? Vale was quiet for a moment. 47 years, he said. The last time I came for maintenance, before that perhaps 60 years. Petra looked at the shelf. They have been alone for a long time, she said, and she said it without sentimentality, just factual acknowledgement, the way she'd said everything since they'd met her. Then she sat down on the floor in front of the shelf, put her rucksack beside her, and appeared to settle in for what might be a while. Harry looked at Vale. Vale looked at Harry. Between them was the specific understanding of 2 people who have been alone with something for a long time being seen by someone who simply directly understood. The archive room, Hermione said from the middle of the floor, her notebook already open. You said you have catalogued everything. What's the most important thing in here? Not the oldest, the most important. What can't we afford not to understand? Vale moved to the center of the room. He stood there for a moment, looking around at the objects with the expression of someone reviewing a lifetime of learning and choosing what to lead with. The submersion record, he said. He moved to a shelf on the north wall midway up and took down an object that was shaped like a cylinder, perhaps 18 inches long, made of something that looked like glass but wasn't. It had too much weight to it. Harry could see that from the way Vale held it, a density that the size didn't suggest. Inside the cylinder, or perhaps as the cylinder, the material wasn't clearly distinct from the content, was a continuous thread of light that moved, running in a slow loop, never quite repeating. This is the complete record of the submersion sequence, not the frequency version, the experiential version. The city recorded what it felt to go under every stage. He held it toward them. You should both hold it, not to access the full record that takes years of study, but to understand the weight of it. Harry took one end, Hermione took the other. The cylinder settled between them and the weight of it arrived, not pain, not vision. Something more fundamental, the sensation of 11,000 years of consequence, a decision that was irreversible and known to be irreversible at the moment it was made anyway because the alternative was worse. He felt the city going under. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, with the precision of a planned thing, the deliberate extinguishing of something enormous and beloved, done by people who loved it, because love sometimes requires you to protect a thing by removing it from the world rather than watching it be destroyed in the world. He felt it and Hermione felt it beside him, and neither of them let go. When he set his end down, Hermione set hers down a beat later, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Not because there was nothing to say, because some things needed the space of silence before they became words. You executed that sequence, Harry said to Vale. I pressed the final key, Vale said. Yes, alone. There were 3 other counselors present, but yes, the execution required a single frequency, mine. He looked at the cylinder. It took 11 seconds. The city went from surface to final depth in 11 seconds, which is, for a structure of this scale, 11 seconds is nearly instantaneous. The engineering was exceptional. He said this last part with the quality of a man complimenting something that also destroyed him, which was a very specific and very human thing to do after 11,000 years of not being particularly human. I watched the water close above the spires from the deep chamber monitoring system. Then I put myself into suspension. A pause. I did not expect to feel it as much as I did, even 300 years later, even now. You don't have to stop feeling it, Hermione said. It should be felt. Vale looked at her, something in his expression that was arriving at something, not quite peace. The approach to peace, the terrain just before it. No, he said, I suppose it should. They spent 2 hours in the archive room. Vale walked them through sections, not comprehensively, not with the cataloguing thoroughness of a researcher, but selectively, the way a person tells you about a place they love by showing you the 3 or 4 things that made them love it rather than listing every feature. He showed them the founding records, the succession history, the physical artifacts of the city's major periods. He showed them the technical records of the resonance network's construction, which Hermione absorbed with the focus of someone who would be returning to this shelf every day for years. He showed them the medical records, the agricultural records, the diplomatic records of Atlantis's relationships with the surface civilizations it had existed alongside, relationships that were, Harry noted, considerably more complex and more frequent than any surface world myth acknowledged. They weren't separate, Harry said, reading a particular inscription that Vale was translating at half speed. Atlantis and the surface world, they traded, they communicated, they sent teachers. Merlin was Atlantean trained, Vale said, with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone who has known this for a long time and finds it neither surprising nor particularly sacred. Not Atlantean-born, but he spent 11 years in this city learning before the submersion. He was 12 when the city went under. He remembered it for the rest of his life. He looked at Harry. The one tradition, the idea of channeling magic through a physical medium, is an adaptation he developed after the submersion, trying to replicate Atlantean frequency work with surface world tools. He paused. It is a remarkable adaptation, genuinely elegant given the constraints, but it is an adaptation of something that was originally done differently. Without wands, Harry said. Without wands, with frequency. With resonance, with the understanding that magic is not force applied through a medium, but agreement between a frequency and the world's response to it. He looked at them both. You experienced this in the trials. The trials don't work with wand magic, they require the direct approach. Which we could do, Hermione said, without trying. Which you could do, Vale said. Yes, the inheritance protocol selects for it. Surface world magic has been running on one tradition for 11,000 years because there was no Atlantis to teach the alternative. You are, both of you, capable of significantly more than what your training has given you access to. He paused. Training that I can provide if you want it. Harry and Hermione looked at each other. The look had a full conversation in it, several conversations actually compressed into the 2 seconds of eye contact they'd been using as shorthand for years, and were only now starting to use for things they previously would have filed under too much to say right now. Yes, Harry said. Obviously yes, Hermione said. Vale nodded. Something settled in him that had been held in suspension since breakfast. Not resolution, he was too old and too complicated for clean resolution, and he wouldn't have trusted it if it had come cleanly, but something that was weight becoming different weight, the way grief and purpose could occupy the same space if you let them. Petra from her spot on the floor by the old shelf said without looking up, I want training also. You'll have it, Harry said. I am also quite good at languages, she said, still not looking up. If the Atlantean record needs translation work, that, Hermione said, is the most welcome thing anyone has said to me since we got here. The city's pulse ran steady through the evening cycle. They ate together, all 4 of them, in the preparation room that had started to feel like a kitchen more than a ceremonial antechamber, the stone vessels producing their personalized food in the unhurried way the city had of making things comfortable without being asked. Conversation was practical and wide-ranging and occasionally technical in a way that excluded no one because everyone at the table was, it turned out, interested in nearly everything. Vale told them about the 3 centuries he'd been awake alone, not as complaint as data, delivered with the precision of a man who had made exhaustive notes on his own experience and was now, for the first time, sharing them with someone. What it was like to run a city's resonance maintenance alone. What it was like to have no one to disagree with. What it was like to watch the surface world through the scrying pools, wars and discoveries, and the slow technological development of people who'd lost their connection to frequency work and been building toward its rediscovery for 11,000 years. You watched all of it, Harry said. All of it that was within the pool's range, Vale said, which was considerable. I watched the Muggle world and the magical world both, the wars. The industrial period, the last century. He looked at Harry. I watched your war, both of them, the first one when you were a child and the second one. I watched the Battle of Hogwarts through the scrying pools. Harry held his gaze. Why didn't you do anything? It was the direct question, the one that had been sitting in the room since Vale had first told them about his centuries of watching. Vale met it without deflecting. Because I told myself it wasn't mine to intervene in, he said. Because I told myself the surface world's conflicts were not Atlantis' concern until the heirs arrived. Because he stopped. Because I was afraid that if I involved myself with the surface world before the succession was confirmed, I would become part of it again, and I didn't know if I could endure that and also endure being here alone. He looked at his hands. That was not the right calculation. No, Harry said. It wasn't. I know, Vale said. I've known it since the first day I watched that war through the pools and didn't act. I added it to the list of things I was right about too late. He looked up. I intend to address that going forward. That's the only direction available, Harry said. Vale looked at him for a moment. You're very young to be this direct, he said. It wasn't criticism. It was the careful observation of someone who was recalibrating their assessment of something they'd thought they understood. I've had a lot of practice at saying what I mean, Harry said. I nearly ran out of chances to say things. Vale absorbed this, then he looked at Hermione. You've been quiet for several minutes, he said, which, based on my observation of the past 2 days, suggests you're thinking about something specific. Hermione looked up from the notebook, which she'd been writing in with one hand while eating with the other, a feat that had stopped surprising Harry about 20 minutes ago. I'm thinking about what comes next, she said. Practically, we've completed the trials, the succession is confirmed, the city is ours, and she paused. That's a sentence that requires unpacking in a significant number of ways. We have to go back to the surface. We have obligations there, people who need to know what's happened. The Ministry, McGonagall, the Weasleys, our lives. She looked at Harry. We can't simply disappear into Atlantis. No, Harry agreed. But we can't simply go back to surface lives either, she said, not unchanged, not as if this didn't happen. She tapped her pen against the notebook. And there's a larger question, the city itself. Atlantis has been the world's most significant missing piece of knowledge for 11,000 years. What do we do with that? Keep it submerged? Tell people? Who do we tell? How do we? One question at a time, Harry said. She looked at him. I have 17 questions. I know. One at a time, she took a breath. All right, first question, do we tell Kingsley? Yes, Harry said without hesitation. He'll want to involve the Ministry. He'll want to, but he'll listen when we explain why that's not how this works, Harry said. Kingsley is good at understanding when something is larger than his institution. McGonagall, absolutely yes. The Weasleys. Harry thought about this for a moment. About Ron, who had been. Things with Ron were complicated in the way that things were complicated when you'd been through too much together, and the shape of the other side didn't match the shape that got you through. They were still friends. They would always be friends. But the version of their friendship that had existed in the war was not the version that existed now, and neither of them had found the right language for what it had become yet. Not yet, he said. Not until we know what we're telling people. She nodded. She'd clearly reached the same conclusion independently. Vale, she said. What do the succession protocols say about Atlantis' relationship to the surface world? Are there guidelines? Vale had been listening to this exchange with an attention that was not quite paternal and not quite collegial, but somewhere between, the attention of someone who had been the only adult in a room for a very long time and was recalibrating to a room where that was no longer true. The original protocols describe a relationship of open exchange, he said. Atlantis was not hidden from the surface world in its active period. The submersion was a temporary measure. The Council intended to resurface when the political conditions were stable. He paused. The political conditions never became stable. 11,000 years of surface world history is essentially a continuous record of political instability. He said this without irony, simply as observable fact. But the intent was always resurfacing, return, re-engagement. Then we resurface, Harry said. The table went quiet in the particular way of statements that are simple and enormous simultaneously. Not all of it, Hermione said. Not dramatically, not the city rises from the sea and announces itself. That's not how this should go. She was thinking as she spoke, the pen moving in small circles on the notebook page. We bring the city back into contact with the world gradually. We establish what Atlantis is and what it isn't. It's not a government, it's not a power structure, it's not a weapon, Harry said. She looked at him. A weapon, yes, it's knowledge. It's 11,000 years of knowledge about frequency and resonance and a form of magic that the surface world lost and has been trying to rediscover ever since. What we do with it, she stopped. What we do with it is the most important question we're going to answer, and we shouldn't answer it tonight. No, Harry agreed. We should answer it with input from people who aren't in this room, she said, including people on the surface who have stakes in how the answer goes. Including squibs, Petra said from her spot on the floor. She said it without emphasis, not a challenge, just a boundary marker, just making sure it was in the room. Including squibs, Hermione said with complete seriousness, specifically and first. Petra nodded. She went back to what she'd been doing, which was running her fingertips in careful patterns on the floor and listening to what the crystal told her about it. She did this the way some people doodle, absent-mindedly, continuously, a background process running while her conscious attention was elsewhere. Harry watched her and thought about what it meant that the city's first new contact with the surface world, after 11,000 years, was a 14-year-old girl from Albania who'd been told she had nothing. He thought about what it meant that the city had looked at the entire surface world and found 3 people, and the 3 people it found were a boy who'd been kept in a cupboard and told he was nothing, a girl who'd been told her knowledge wasn't the right kind of knowledge, and a girl who'd been told she had no magic at all. He thought about what Atlantis was selecting for. He thought he was beginning to understand. 3 days passed. Not quickly and not slowly, with the density of days that are full from edge to edge with things that matter, the kind of days that seem longer than they are when you're in them, and exactly the right length when you look back. They learned the city. Vale taught and Harry learned with the specific quality of attention he'd always brought to things that were genuinely his, not the dutiful attention of a student who'd been told to learn, but the hungry attention of someone discovering that the subject was in fact exactly what they'd been looking for. Hermione learned at 3 times Harry's pace by any measurable metric, and at the same pace by any metric that counted, because she wasn't just acquiring information, she was building a framework for it, and the framework required more time than the information. Petra mapped the frequency library. She sat with the oldest objects on the archive room shelves, and received what they were broadcasting with the fluency of someone doing something they were born to do, which she was. By the second day she had established what Solon called with visible respect, a primary frequency dialogue with 4 of the objects in the deepest section of the archive. By the third day she had begun very tentatively and with enormous concentration to translate what they were telling her. She is, Solon told Harry with the flat certainty he used for things he was very sure about, the most naturally frequency-sensitive individual I have recorded data on. Including Atlantean-born individuals. Don't tell her that yet, Harry said. Solon looked at him with his usual calibrated expression. Why not? Because she's 14 and she's just found out she's remarkable, Harry said. Give her a bit of time to be 14 and remarkable before you make it into a title. He paused. She'll carry it better if it grows into her rather than being dropped on her. Solon considered this for a moment. That is, he said, a more nuanced position than I would have expected on the subject. I had someone very wise explain to me once that being the chosen one feels very different from choosing, Harry said. I'm trying to give her the version I didn't get. Solon looked at him for a long moment with those crystalline eyes and said nothing. But something in his expression was a thing Harry had seen in Dumbledore's portraits and in McGonagall's face in the best moments, the look of someone watching a person be exactly what they hoped they would be. Hermione found the Atlantean Medical Archive on the 2nd afternoon. Harry heard about it before he saw it because she appeared in the corridor outside the archive room where he'd been working with Vale. Said Harry, come and look at this right now, in a voice that was trying very hard to be controlled and not quite managing it, and then led him at near-running pace to a section of the resonance library on the city's eastern ring. The section she'd found was a dedicated matrix, a cluster of resonance storage cells that were running at a different frequency from the surrounding network, more complex, more densely layered. She put both hands on the wall and looked at him. This is the medical frequency archive, she said. The Atlantean medical tradition, it's entirely resonance-based. They didn't use potions, they didn't use healing spells, they used frequency work. Specific resonances applied to specific biological frequencies to correct dysfunction. She was very controlled, very deliberate. Harry, do you know what kinds of things they could treat with this? Tell me, he said. Everything the wizarding world treats with potions that have side effects. Everything the muggle world treats with surgery or pharmaceuticals, degenerative conditions, neurological dysfunction, trauma-based. She stopped, restarted. The Cruciatus curse's long-term neurological effects. The damage it does, Frank and Alice Longbottom. She held his eyes. The archive has documented case records of resonance treatments for curse-induced neurological damage, detailed case records with frequency specifications and outcome data. She paused. I haven't fully translated the records yet. I need Vale's help with the technical terminology and Petra's help with the frequency keys for the medical section. But Harry, if this works, if the treatment protocols are what they appear to be, Neville, Harry said. Neville's parents, she said. Yes, and there are others, from both wars. There are people in St. Mungo's right now who, she stopped again, pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment, a gesture he rarely saw from her. We have to be sure before we say anything to anyone. We have to translate the records fully and understand the methodology and know whether it's actually applicable to surface world human biology or whether the Atlantean cases are significantly different. We'll be sure, Harry said. We'll do it properly. He put his hand on her shoulder. But Hermione, if it works. She looked at him. If it works, she said, it changes everything. He thought about Neville's parents. About the years Neville had been to St. Mungo's with his grandmother, the visits described in the quiet way of someone who had made peace with something not being fixable. He thought about Neville's face when he talked about them, the specific quality of love that has accepted its own grief. Then let's make sure it works, he said. She nodded, opened her notebook, started writing. He went to find Vale. On the fourth morning they went back to the surface. Not permanently, not even close to permanently. But the world above had not stopped existing while they were in Atlantis, and Kingsley had been waiting with a patience that Harry suspected was being maintained through considerable effort, and McGonagall deserved to know what had happened before she heard it through any other channel, and Petra needed to contact her sister before the Belgrade story stopped holding. Solon escorted them to the entry chamber. The water above the entry arch was the same grey-green North Atlantic cold it had always been, unchanged by everything that had happened below it. Vale came as far as the entry chamber and stopped at the arch. "You're not coming up," Harry said. "Not today," Vale said. He was looking at the water above the arch with an expression that was careful and complicated. "The surface world and I have not been there in 11,000 years. I would like to approach that at my own pace." He paused. "Also, someone needs to maintain the resonance network and show Petra the secondary frequency keys for the Level 4 archive before you return." "That's very practical of you," Hermione said. "I'm very practical," Vale said with the flatness that Harry had identified as his default mode for things he felt more than he was saying. Come back." He looked at Harry. "The city will know when you're at the entry point. It will open." "Like it knows us," Harry said. "It knows you," Vale said. "It has known your frequencies since you completed the trials. You can find it from anywhere." He looked between them. "That is not a metaphor. The city's resonance extends farther than you'd expect. If you need it, we'll feel it," Harry said. "Yes," Vale said. He looked for a moment like a person who was finding the end of something very long and the beginning of something else and was not sure which feeling to lead with. Then he said, "Go then, I'll be here." Harry nodded. He turned to Petra. "Ready." She had her rucksack on, her jacket zipped. She looked like a 14-year-old girl from Albania who had spent 4 days in an 11,000-year-old city and was returning to the world with the particular composure of someone who has discovered that they fit somewhere which makes everywhere else more navigable. "My sister is going to ask many questions," Petra said. "Tell her the truth," Hermione said. "As much of it as she can handle." "She is a Hufflepuff," Petra said. "She can handle most things." "Perfect house for it," Harry agreed. They swam up together, the three of them, and the pressure dome built between them as automatically as breathing now, the shared frequency of 2 airs and their receiver rising through 50 feet of cold North Atlantic water toward a grey January sky. Harry felt the city below him as they ascended, not fading, not diminishing, but present, a warm, deep pulse running in his scar with the steadiness of something that was part of him now rather than calling to him. He didn't look back down. He didn't need to. They broke the surface into cold wind and low cloud and the smell of salt and the sound of a seabird somewhere to the west, and Harry gasped a breath of the world's air and found it thin and good and real. Beside him, Hermione surfaced with her hair everywhere and her expression alert, and Petra came up between them blowing water from her mouth, and then all three of them were treading water in the North Atlantic in January and looking at each other. "Warming charm," Hermione said. "Obviously," Harry said and cast it, which was the first one magic he'd used in 4 days and felt, interestingly, both natural and slightly reductive, like speaking a dialect you'd learned before you knew the full language. Functional, limited, sufficient for now. "There is a fishing boat," Petra said, pointing east. "About a mile." "We'll flag it," Harry said. "Won't they find that strange?" Petra said. 3 people in the water with no boat." "We'll be creative," Hermione said. She was already thinking through it. Harry could see the logistics engine starting up, the beautiful practical machinery of Hermione Granger deciding how to make an impossible situation presentable to a Muggle fisherman. "I've got a story." "You have a story for everything," Harry said. "I have a story for most things," she said. "I'm still working on the story for we've been in Atlantis for 4 days, but I have the early drafts." He laughed. Properly, not the careful, controlled laugh he'd been operating with for 8 months, but the real one, the one that came from something actually being funny rather than the performance of finding things acceptable. The seabird called again somewhere in the low cloud. The fishing boat moved slowly on the horizon. Hermione was watching him laugh with an expression that was unguarded in the new way she had, the way since the will trial of not bothering to put the careful cover back over things. "You look different," she said. "Different how?" "Like yourself," she said. "More than I've seen in since before the war maybe, since Hogwarts maybe, like the thing that was braced has stopped bracing." He looked at her. He thought about the cupboard and the forest and the hollow where relief was supposed to live. He thought about Atlantis with its 11,000-year patience, its careful choice, its knowledge that healing something required understanding what it had been before you could imagine what it could become. "Something that was waiting to be somewhere finished waiting," he said. She held his gaze with the specific quality of someone who is deciding to remember something. Then she turned toward the fishing boat and raised her wand and sent a small light signal above the water, a muggle-friendly flare of white that would read as a distress signal and not as magic. "Come on," she said. "We've got a lot to do." "We've always got a lot to do," Harry said. "Yes," she said, "but now I'm not dreading it." He started swimming east. She swam beside him. Petra swam ahead, her bright green jacket moving in the chop of the water like a signal of its own, already angling toward the boat with the directional certainty of someone who knows where they're going. McGonagall's reaction 2 days later in her office at Hogwarts was to sit completely still for 45 seconds after Hermione finished speaking, pour herself a measure of something from a bottle that had definitely not been on her desk when they arrived, and say, "You went to Atlantis." "We went to Atlantis," Harry confirmed. "You completed a 3-stage magical inheritance trial in an 11,000-year-old civilization that has been on the floor of the North Atlantic since before written history." "We did, and you are now, by the legal framework of that civilization, its confirmed successors." "Also yes." McGonagall looked at her glass, looked at them, looked at the window. Then she said, "I've spent 40 years telling students that there is always more to learn about magic than they currently know. I was apparently underestimating this by a considerable margin." "A fair assessment," Hermione said. "The medical archive," McGonagall said. "What you described, the resonance treatment protocols for curse-induced neurological damage." "We're still translating," Hermione said. "We haven't verified applicability yet. We're being careful." "Frank and Alice Longbottom," McGonagall said. "Yes," Harry said, quietly, definitively. McGonagall set her glass down with a deliberate care. She looked at her desk, at the stacks of administrative correspondence and the marking and the 7 hours worth of ministry communication and the countless urgent small things that constituted running a school, and then she looked at Harry and Hermione with an expression that was composed of several large things managed very tightly together. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Cover," Harry said. "When the ministry asks where we've been and why, not lies, misdirection, time. We need time to understand what we have before it becomes a political question. That will be approximately 4 days before Kingsley decides he needs to know more," she said. "We've already told Kingsley the outline," Hermione said. He's being Kingsley. He's concerned and supportive and quietly frantic, and he's giving us the space we asked for." 48 hours, McGonagall said. "He said 48 hours when you left." "We came back in 4 days," Harry said. "He did not come after us." "No," McGonagall said with something that was almost a smile. "He did not." She looked at him steadily. "You told him where to put his 48-hour observation window, didn't you?" "I did so respectfully," Harry said. "I'm sure," she said. She stood up, moved to the window, looked out at the grounds, January, the lake still, the distant line of the forbidden forest dark against the white sky. "Neville's parents," she said to the window. "If the protocols work as documented," Hermione said carefully, "and if the treatment is applicable, we need several more weeks of translation and study before we—" "I heard you the first time," McGonagall said. "I'm not asking you to promise anything. I'm asking you to know that I know, that someone on the surface knows what you're working toward." She turned back, "so that it isn't only yours to carry." The room was quiet in the way that McGonagall's rooms had always been quiet, not empty but full, the specific quality of a space inhabited by someone who had made it mean something over a long time. "Thank you," Hermione said. McGonagall sat back down. She picked up her quill. She made a notation on one of her parchments with the brisk efficiency of someone returning to work. "I'll manage Thicket from the ministry when he comes asking," she said. "He's been asking for a follow-up assessment since you vanished for 4 days without explanation. I'll tell him you're conducting private research into pre-Merlinic magical traditions." She dipped the quill. "Which is technically accurate." "Impeccably accurate," Hermione agreed. "Good," she wrote for a moment, then without looking up, "The girl, Petra, she's back in Albania," Harry said. "She'll be returning to the city next week." "She should be in school," McGonagall said. Harry opened his mouth. "Not here necessarily," McGonagall said, still writing. "I recognize that her situation is specific, but she should be learning in an organized context with people who understand what she is and what she needs." She looked up. "When you know what that looks like, tell me. I'll help build it." Harry looked at her. He thought about all the things she'd done for him, the steady presence, the expectation that he could be better than he thought, the way she'd fought in the battle alongside students half her age and never made it heroic, just necessary. He thought about her letter to the ministry about unauthorized structural modification. He thought about her pouring scotch and saying, "What do you need?" before she said anything else. "Okay," he said. She nodded, back to the letter. "One more thing," Hermione said. McGonagall waited. "The trial of memory," Hermione said. "It surfaces everything you've been avoiding." She paused. Is there someone you'd want to tell that there's a place now where that kind of processing can happen, not for the trials specifically, just the city's resonance has a quality to it. If someone has been carrying something for a long time." She looked at her hands. "It helps." McGonagall was quiet for a moment. She was looking at her desk, but her eyes were not reading anything on it. "Perhaps," she said. "In time." "In time," Hermione said. Kingsley, when Harry and Hermione sat across from his desk the following morning, listened to the complete account without interrupting once, which was the ministerial equivalent of someone else's running commentary. He had a stillness to him that was different from Vale's ancient stillness, the stillness of a man who has decided that the most useful thing he can do in this moment is listen, and who has the discipline to actually do it. When they finished, he looked at his desk for a moment, then he looked up. "You're telling me," he said, "that Atlantis is real, that it has been on the floor of the North Atlantic for 11,000 years, that you are its confirmed successors, and that it contains the most significant body of magical knowledge the world has never had access to?" "That's the outline, yes," Harry said, "and you're telling me before you tell anyone else." "We are telling you now because you're the person who has to manage the world above the water," Harry said, "and because you deserve to know. And because we trust you." He said this simply, it was simply true. Kingsley absorbed the weight of "we trust you" and the full consequence of what it meant in the context of what they'd just told him. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" "Same as what we asked McGonagall," Hermione said. "Time, space. When Atlantis is ready to re-engage with the surface world, and that will happen, it's designed to happen eventually. We want that to happen deliberately and carefully and in a way that is not a ministry press release or a Wisengamot policy crisis. We want to build the relationship between Atlantis and the surface world from honest ground." "The squib question," Kingsley said, and Harry and Hermione both looked at him because he'd gotten there without them naming it. Kingsley noticed their look. "If Atlantis's understanding of magical capacity is fundamentally different from the wizarding world's classification system," he said, "then the classification system is wrong, and the ministry has been wrong about a significant number of people for a very long time." He paused. "I've known that for years. I've been working within a system that I knew was wrong because I couldn't change it from outside." He looked at Harry. "You've just handed me the evidence base to change it from inside." "We've handed you the beginning of the evidence base," Harry said. "It needs to be built carefully with Petra's input, and with other frequency-sensitive individuals who have been misclassified. It's not our data to own, it belongs to the people it's about." Kingsley nodded. "Agreed." He made a note. "What else?" "St. Mungo's," Hermione said. "The long-term spell damage ward. When we've verified the medical protocols, and we're months away from that minimum, we'll need a working relationship with their research division. Not announcement, not publicity, working relationship, people who can be trusted with ongoing research." "I know 3 people at St. Mungo's who can be trusted with anything," Kingsley said. "I'll make introductions." "Good," she said. "And the city itself," Kingsley said, "the physical structure. If it resurfaces eventually, the international implications of a sovereign non-governmental magical entity appearing in international waters. We'll cross that when we get there," Harry said. "It's not surfacing tomorrow, or this year, possibly not this decade. The city has been patient for 11,000 years. It can wait until we've built the relationships that make resurfacing mean something other than a geopolitical crisis." Kingsley looked at him for a long moment with the expression he'd had in the Department of Mysteries, the one that was measuring something and finding it not wanting. "You've thought about this more carefully than your reputation as someone who acts first would suggest," he said. "I've been told that before," Harry said. "I've also been inside a city that failed because the people who ran it stopped thinking carefully. It's a useful lesson." "Evidently." Kingsley stood, extended his hand. "Harry, Hermione." He looked between them. "Whatever you need, whatever I can do from this building, within the law and outside it where necessary, you have it." Harry shook his hand. Hermione did too. They left. They walked from the ministry into a February afternoon that had somewhere between winter and spring in it, still cold, but with the cold going thin at the edges, the light lasting 10 minutes longer than it had the week before, the specific London quality of a season uncertain about itself. Harry had his hands in his pockets and Hermione had her bag over her shoulder and her notebook tucked under her arm, and they walked without particular direction down a street that was ordinary in every way that mattered. "Neville next," she said. "Yeah, what do we tell him?" "The truth," Harry said. "As much of it as we can. He deserves the truth." "He'll want to come," she said. "He'll want to come," Harry agreed. "And he can, eventually." When Vales had a bit more time to adjust to other people being in the city, he paused. "And when Neville's ready to hear what we might have found for his parents without getting his hopes up in a way that—" "I know," she said. "We do it properly." "We do it properly," he agreed. "All of it properly." She was quiet for a moment, walking beside him, her shoulder bumping his in the rhythm of 2 people who have walked beside each other enough that their gaits have found each other's timing. "I was thinking," she said, "about what Solon said, the trial of voice, that it asks what you choose." She paused. "I've been thinking about what I choose, not what I'm assigned to or what needs doing or what the trial's required, what I actually choose." She looked at him sideways. "I choose this, all of it, Atlantis and the work," and she stopped. I choose you. I just wanted to say it clearly out of a trial chamber in the daylight on a London street so it's on the record somewhere normal." He looked at her. The February light was thin and the street was ordinary, and she was looking at him with the complete honesty of someone who has stopped measuring risk against feeling. "It's on the record," he said. She nodded. She was trying not to smile and failing. "Good." They kept walking. The city behind them was the city it had always been, crowded, oblivious, magnificently indifferent to the fact that 3 miles under the North Atlantic, an 11,000-year-old civilization was breathing with 2 new frequencies in its walls, warm and steady, and finally, after all of it, home. Below the water in the archive room on level 4, Erasmus Vale sat across from Petra Vasic on the crystal floor and held one end of the founding vessel while she held the other. and together they listened to what the oldest object in the city's memory was saying. It was saying, as it had been saying for 11,000 years, very patiently, the same thing it had always been saying. This is what we built, this is what we knew, this is what we hoped, come and find it. And finally, after everything, someone had. Vale looked at the girl across from him, this child from Albania who had no wand and perfect pitch for the oldest music in the world, and he thought about 300 years of alone and the weight of what he'd carried and the city's inhuman patience. He thought about Harry Potter standing in level 7 saying recognition is different from authority and you've needed the first one. He thought about Hermione Granger saying you're part of what we're inheriting. He thought about what it meant to be witnessed after all this time by people who chose to see. Petra, he said. She looked up. Counselor, when they return, he said, I would like to show you the level 2 acoustic library. It has records of the founding frequency, the original tone the city was built to. It has not been properly heard in 11,000 years. He paused. I believe you can hear it. She looked at him steadily with her dark eyes and her perfectly direct attention. I know I can, she said. I've been hearing it since I sat down. He looked at her for a moment. Then slowly, with the care of something very old relearning a mechanics it had once known well, Erasmus Vale smiled. The city breathed around them, warm and full and running complete. 11,000 years of waiting, finally done.